Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where we take a calm look at the planet, its history, and the people who lived on it long before our own busy schedules began. Tonight, we're travelling to the southern coast of Peru, to a place where the ground carries pictures so large that a person standing beside them may see only a path, a shallow groove, or a row of stones. From higher ground, however, those marks begin to connect. A wing appears, then a beak, then the long legs of a bird stretching across the desert. Elsewhere, straight lines run toward the horizon, triangles widen across the plain, and animals the size of buildings rest beneath the open sky. These are the lines and geoglyphs of Nazca and Palpa, often known simply as the Nazca Lines. They lie on the dry plains of southern Peru, roughly 400 kilometers from Lima, in a region between the Pacific coast and the western slopes of the Andes. Across this landscape are hundreds of figurative designs and a much larger number of straight lines, paths, trapezoids, spirals, and other geometric forms. Some are compact enough to fit within a modern sports field, others travel for kilometers. Together, they turn a wide section of desert into one of the largest surviving works of land art ever made. Before we go any farther, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're somewhere rainy, with water tapping against the window. Perhaps your room is surrounded by city lights, or perhaps everything outside has already gone quiet. Have you ever looked at a map, a field, a coastline, or even the pattern of cracks in a pavement and felt certain that there was a picture hiding inside it? Human beings are remarkably good at finding shapes. We see faces in clouds, creatures in shadows, and occasionally a suspiciously judgmental expression in a piece of toast. In the Nazca Desert, though, the shapes are not accidents. Someone planned them, measured them, and cleared the ground to make them visible. If you find this kind of slow journey soothing, you can leave a like and subscribe to Just About Earth. It helps this quiet corner reach other people who enjoy history, science, landscapes, and questions that do not need to be hurried. You might also share where you are listening from, because there is something fitting about people in different countries, climates, and time zones gathering around the story of a desert made meaningful by people who lived there long before modern borders, aircraft, or satellite images. Now settle into whatever position feels comfortable. There will be no sudden turns here, although the monkey we will eventually meet does have a tail that seems determined to curl into every available space. We will begin with the desert itself, because the lines make little sense when separated from the land beneath them. The Nazca region is extremely dry. Rainfall is scarce, vegetation is limited across the open plains, and the surface is covered in stones darkened over long periods by weathering. When ancient makers moved those darker stones aside, they exposed lighter soil below. The contrast created a visible line without deep digging, complicated machinery, or a delivery of white paint that would have raised difficult questions at the local shop. The method was simple, but the results were not. A narrow strip could be cleared to form a single line. A larger area could be swept clean to create a broad triangle or trapezoid. A figure could be outlined with one continuous route, allowing the shape to unfold across the surface in a controlled sequence. Stakes, chords, smaller sketches, and careful counting may have helped the makers enlarge their designs. None of this required a view from an aeroplane. Nearby slopes and foothills provided elevated viewpoints, and people working on the ground could follow a plan in the same way builders can construct a large house without floating above the roof. That point is worth remembering, because the Nazca lines are often introduced as drawings that could only have been made for viewers in the sky. It is an effective sentence. It is also the sort of sentence that encourages dramatic music, mysterious pauses, and a presenter standing in the desert with one eyebrow raised. The designs are certainly striking from the air, and modern flights have made them famous around the world. Yet many can also be understood from surrounding high ground, while the lines themselves could be walked, approached, crossed, and experienced at human level. Their makers did not need to see the entire finished image every morning in order to know what they had created. For centuries, the desert helped protect their work. The same lack of rain that made farming difficult reduced the amount of water washing across the surface. Low vegetation meant roots did not spread through the cleared paths. The stones also helped stabilize the ground, and the region's dry climate slowed many natural processes that would erase similar markings elsewhere. This does not mean the lines are indestructible. Roads, vehicles, mining, construction, and careless footsteps can damage a surface that has survived precisely because it changed so little. The lines may look permanent from a plane, but on the ground they are surprisingly vulnerable. The oldest geoglyph traditions in the wider region began before the period usually associated with the Nazca people. Communities linked with the earlier Paracas tradition also made large designs, especially on slopes where figures could be seen from below. Over time, the practice expanded across flatter desert plains. UNESCO dates major phases of line making from around 500 BC to AD 500, while the wider cultural landscape reflects a longer sequence of activity involving different communities. The result was not one enormous project completed under a single ruler. It was a tradition repeated, changed, and renewed across generations. That makes the desert less like a single picture, and more like a place where people kept returning to add new marks. Some lines overlap older ones. Some figures belong to different periods. Some routes point toward hills, valleys, water sources, or gathering places. The surface records many decisions made over a long time, which is one reason a single explanation has never satisfied every archaeologist. Asking what the Nazca Lines were for may be a little like asking what buildings are for. A building can be a home, a temple, a storehouse, a meeting hall, or somewhere you accidentally spend 20 minutes looking for the correct exit. Form, location, and use all matter. Among the best-known figures are a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, a large bird often described as a condor, a pelican or heron, a dog, a whale, and several human or supernatural forms. Their names are modern descriptions, and not every identification is certain. A long beak might suggest one species to one researcher and another species to someone else. The people who made the images may also have understood animals through stories and religious meanings that do not fit neatly into modern field guides. They were not simply making a desert zoo for future sightseeing flights. The animals connect the lines to the wider artistic world of the Nazca people. Similar creatures, plants, human figures, and supernatural beings appear on pottery and textiles. Nazca ceramic artists became known for strong colours and complex painted imagery. Their vessels show birds, fish, crops, masked beings, human heads, musicians, and figures that combine features from several parts of the natural world. Because the society left no known writing system that explains these images in words, researchers compare objects, burial contexts, settlements, ritual spaces, and the landscape itself. The art offers evidence, but it does not provide convenient captions. Ancient artists rarely seem to consider the needs of future documentary writers. Water is one of the most important parts of this setting. The Nazca people lived in one of the driest inhabited regions on Earth, but rivers descending from the Andes created valleys where agriculture was possible. Seasonal water, underground flows, irrigation, and careful planning supported communities that grew crops such as maize, beans, squash, and peppers. In a place where rainfall could not be taken for granted, water was not merely useful. It affected survival, social organisation, ritual life, travel, and the timing of work. This has led many researchers to connect at least some of the lines with ceremonies concerned with water and fertility. Certain lines lead toward hills or areas associated with water. Offerings and broken pottery have been found in parts of the landscape. Broad cleared spaces may have held gatherings, while some routes seem suited to processions. People may have walked along them in groups, carrying objects, playing music, making offerings, or visiting sacred points. The British Museum notes evidence for worship, pilgrimage, and ceremonies connected with the search for water and fertility, with lines converging around places where communities could assemble. Imagine the lines from that level rather than from the window of a small aircraft. You're not looking down at a complete hummingbird. You're walking along a pale route bordered by darker stones. The ground is firm beneath your feet. Other people move ahead and behind you. Ceramic panpipes sound across the open plain. Cloth, feathers, painted vessels, food, and offerings add colour to a landscape dominated by brown, grey and pale yellow. A line that appears almost silent in a photograph may once have been filled with footsteps, music, conversation, smoke and expectation. Archaeologists have found ceramic panpipes associated with Nazca culture, and images on pottery also suggest processions involving musicians and people carrying offerings. These clues do not prove that every line hosted a ceremony, but they help move the story away from the idea of empty drawings made for an unknown audience. The landscape may have been active, it may have guided movement, separated spaces, connected communities, and turned a difficult environment into a shared religious setting. Astronomy has also played a major role in explanations of the lines. Some researchers have proposed that certain lines mark the rising or setting positions of the sun, stars, or constellations. Seasonal observations would have mattered to farming communities, and the sky was deeply connected with time, weather, and ritual across the ancient Andes. Maria Ricci, the German-born mathematician and researcher who devoted much of her life to studying and protecting the lines, strongly supported astronomical interpretations. Her careful mapping helped bring global attention to the site. However, the enormous number of lines creates a problem. When hundreds or thousands of directions are available, some will align with noticeable points in the sky simply by chance. Modern research has therefore moved away from the idea that the entire landscape was on an enormous astronomical calendar with every line serving the same purpose. Some alignments may have been deliberate, others may relate to routes, hills, water, ceremonies, or social boundaries. A reasonable explanation can include the sky without requiring the whole desert to function like a gigantic wristwatch. The most famous alternative explanations are, of course, the ones involving visitors from another world. The argument usually goes like this: the figures are huge, they're easiest to see from above, and ancient people lacked modern technology. Therefore, something unusual must have helped them. It is a tempting story because it replaces missing information with a dramatic answer. Unfortunately for the dramatic answer, ancient people were fully capable of planning large works. Monumental architecture, roads, earthworks, irrigation systems, and carefully organised landscapes appear in societies around the world. Large size is not evidence of extraterrestrial assistance. It is evidence that human cooperation can achieve things that are difficult for one person working alone. There is also a quieter problem with the alien idea. It removes the Nazca people from their own achievement. Instead of asking what knowledge, beliefs, labour and social relationships allowed communities to mark the desert, it hands the most impressive part of their culture to imaginary outsiders. The real explanation may be less suitable for a film poster, but it is far more interesting. Generations of people observed the land, understood its surfaces, organised work, developed shared symbols, and returned to meaningful places. They did not need engines in the sky. They needed memory, planning, and enough people willing to move stones beneath a sun that was probably not accepting complaints. The name Nazca civilization can also create a misleading picture if it makes us imagine a single empire with one capital, one king, and a central office responsible for approving all monkey tales. The Nazca world seems to have included communities spread through river valleys, connected by shared styles, rituals, trade and pilgrimage. Cahuachi, a major ceremonial centre near the Nazca River, contained large adobe structures and attracted people for gatherings and religious activity. It was not necessarily a crowded city in the modern sense. Much of the population lived in smaller settlements, farming the valleys and moving through networks that joined coast, desert and highlands. Their environment demanded practical knowledge. The Pacific lay to the west, supporting fishing communities and providing marine resources. The Andes rose to the east, bringing seasonal water and access to highland materials. Between them stretched desert crossed by fertile valleys. Trade linked these zones. Objects and images suggest connections reaching beyond the immediate region, including access to rainforest birds and highland obsidian. The Nazca people were not isolated in an empty wasteland. They lived within a varied world of exchange, movement and environmental knowledge. This helps explain why animals from different habitats appear in their art. A monkey is not a common resident of the coastal desert. Hummingbirds, seabirds, fish, felines, serpents, and other creatures carry different associations and may point toward rain, fertility, power, movement, or distant regions. A figure drawn on the ground could connect a local place with a much larger understanding of the world. The image was not required to be naturalistic. It only needed to be recognizable and meaningful to the people who used it. From a modern distance, mystery tends to become the main attraction. We ask why the lines exist, how they were made, and whether a single hidden answer waits beneath the sand. Archaeology usually offers something more complicated. There may be several answers because the lines were produced across centuries. One figure may have marked a ritual path. A trapezoid may have created a gathering space. A straight line may have linked a settlement with a hill. Another may have pointed toward water or a seasonal event. Meanings could also change. A place important to one generation can be reused by the next for a related purpose, a different purpose, or simply because everyone has become accustomed to meeting there. Consider a modern road, church, memorial, public square and sports field. Each shapes movement and behaviour differently, yet all can gather people and carry shared meaning. Now remove signs, written records, photographs and spoken explanations. Leave only the ground plans for people 2,000 years later. They might correctly identify some functions and completely misunderstand others. Perhaps they would decide that a roundabout was used for ceremonial circling. On certain mornings, this would not be entirely wrong. The Nazca landscape asks us to be patient with uncertainty. We know how the lines were physically made. We know that they belong to a long tradition associated with Paracas and Nazca communities. We know that designs connect with imagery found in their art. We have evidence for ritual movement, offerings, gatherings, and concern with water and fertility. We also know that no single theory explains every mark across such a large and varied area. The uncertainty is not a failure. It is an honest description of what remains when a society leaves images but no written guide to their meaning. Seen this way, the desert drawings become less strange and more human. They still surprise us, but they are no longer impossible objects dropped into history without context. They came from community facing the ordinary and serious needs of life: water, food, cooperation, belief, memory, status, loss, and hope. The scale is extraordinary, but the reasons for gathering may have felt familiar. People came together because some tasks were too large to complete alone. Some ceremonies mattered more when shared, and some places seemed to connect daily life with forces beyond immediate control. Our route will stay close to those people. We will look at the valleys where they farmed, the homes and settlements they built, the pottery they painted, the textiles they wove, and the ceremonial centre that drew travellers across the region. The lines are the part of Nazca culture most visible from the sky, but they are not the whole culture. Beneath the mystery is a society of farmers, artists, engineers, fishers, traders, religious specialists, parents, children, musicians and workers who learn to live between the ocean and the mountains. The objects and places around the lines still provide clues. A painted bowl can show which animals mattered. A broken vessel can mark where an offering was made. A canal can reveal how water moved. A textile can preserve a pattern and a choice of colour. A settlement can tell us where people cooked, stored food, repaired tools, and returned at the end of a day. Taken together, these traces bring the desert back to life in a way that an aerial photograph alone cannot. So keep the image of the Great Plain in mind, with dark stones above lighter earth and long lines extending beyond easy view. Then allow the view to lower gradually. Come down from the aircraft, past the hillsides, toward the river valleys. The giant bird and curling monkey remain behind us for a while as fields, canals, adobe walls, painted vessels, and ordinary footsteps come into focus. To understand why people drew across the desert, we first need to understand how they lived within it. To understand the people who made the enormous desert drawings, it helps to leave the open plain for a while and move toward the narrow green valleys that cut across the southern coast of Peru. From the air, the region can look almost empty. On the ground, it is a landscape of sharp contrasts. The Pacific Ocean lies to the west, the Andes rise to the east. Between them are dry plains, low hills, riverbeds, cultivated strips, and settlements that depended on water arriving from rainfall far away in the mountains. The Nazca people lived in this region for many centuries, roughly from 200 BC until around AD 650, although the cultural traditions connected with them began earlier and changed gradually over time. They were not simply the people who drew the lines. They were farmers, fishers, potters, weavers, builders, traders, musicians, religious specialists, and families trying to manage daily life in a place where a missed season of water could become a serious problem. The rivers of the Rio Grande and Nazca drainage were fed by seasonal rain in the Andes. Some years brought useful flows, other years were far less generous. The river valleys could support agriculture when water was directed into fields through irrigation systems, but the broad pampas between them remained extremely dry. This meant that most permanent daily activity was concentrated close to water and cultivable soil. A settlement might sit near a field, a canal, a river course, or a route leading toward another valley. The distance between a fertile strip and bare desert could be surprisingly small. A person could leave cultivated land and, after a short walk, find themselves surrounded by stones, dust, and the sort of silence that makes every sandal sound much louder than expected. Water shaped the working year. Fields had to be prepared, channels cleared, crops planted, and harvests gathered at the right time. Archaeological sources identify maize, beans, squash, peanuts, manioc, sweet potatoes, fruits, and other plants among the crops available to Nazca communities, while cotton was grown for textile production. Not every crop would have been planted in every place or every season, but the variety mattered. A mixed food supply reduced dependence on a single harvest and provided different foods for storage, cooking, offerings, and exchange. The coast also supplied fish and other marine resources, linking farming communities inland with people closer to the Pacific. The result was not a life supported by one miraculous desert crop. It was a connected system involving valleys, coastlines, uplands, labour, and careful observation. Daily farming involved simple tools, repeated physical work, and close attention to soil and water. Canals needed maintenance because sediment, stones, or collapsed banks could reduce the flow. Fields could not be treated as though water were endless. Every useful stream had to be guided, shared, and watched. Later in the Nazca sequence, underground filtration galleries known as puquios may have helped bring groundwater to the surface in some valleys, although researchers have debated exactly when different examples were constructed. Archaeological surveys suggest that these systems were not present in the earliest Nazca phases and were more likely introduced in later periods, with some perhaps built or modified after the Nazca era. That uncertainty is important because it prevents us from handing every impressive water feature in the region to the same people without checking the dates first. Ancient engineering deserves admiration, but it also deserves accurate paperwork. Most Nazca people did not live in a huge capital city. Communities were distributed through several valleys, and the evidence points to a regional society connected by shared religious ideas, artistic styles, exchange and ceremonial gatherings rather than a single tightly controlled empire. Local leaders may have organised labour, managed resources, sponsored ceremonies, or represented particular communities, but the political structure seems to have varied through time. The name Nazca civilization is useful, yet it can make the population sound more uniform than it probably was. People in neighbouring valleys could share pottery styles and ritual practices while still thinking of themselves as members of different local groups. Anyone who has watched two nearby towns argue over which one makes the correct version of a familiar dish will understand that shared culture does not always produce complete agreement. Homes were generally made from materials available in the region, including adobe, reeds, wood, and plant fibres. Archaeological remains from domestic settlements are less famous than the ceremonial mounds and desert images, partly because ordinary buildings were modest and often changed or disappeared over time. Within a household, people cooked, stored food, repaired tools, spun fibre, cared for children, and prepared for work in the fields. Storage was especially useful in an unpredictable environment. Dried crops and seeds could help a family through periods when fresh harvests were limited. Pottery vessels held water, food, and drink, while baskets, gourds, cloth bags, and nets handled many of the tasks for which a modern household might use an alarming number of plastic containers. The surviving pottery shows that Nazca craftspeople developed one of the most recognisable ceramic traditions in the ancient Americas. Many vessels were formed by coiling clay, covered with mineral slips, fired, and polished to a smooth surface. Artists used a wide range of colours, including reds, yellows, browns, black, white, grey, violet, and shades created from mineral pigments. Some vessels had two spouts joined by a bridge handle. Others took the form of bowls, jars, cups, or sculpted figures. The painted surfaces carried birds, fish, plants, crops, people, severed heads, and supernatural beings. A fine vessel was therefore more than a useful container. It could display skill, identity, status, religious knowledge, and connections to a wider visual tradition. Many colours remain vivid because vessels were preserved in the dry climate, particularly in graves and ceremonial deposits. Looking at them today can create the misleading impression that Nazca life was constantly bright and freshly painted. Daily objects would have become scratched, repaired, stained, and worn, just as things do in every household. A beautifully decorated jar might appear at a feast or ceremony, while plainer pottery handled cooking and storage. Skilled potters needed knowledge of clay, fuel, pigments, temperature, and firing conditions. One poorly controlled firing could ruin hours of work, a situation that would have been deeply disappointing even before anyone invented the phrase creative process. Textile production required just as much knowledge. Cotton grew in the coastal valleys, while camelid fibre came through connections with the highlands. Surviving Nazca textiles include woven and embroidered pieces made from both materials. Fibres had to be cleaned, spun into thread, dyed, arranged on a loom, and worked into cloth. Fine clothing and ceremonial textiles demanded patience and exact control. Some pieces used strong colours and repeated figures. Others included complex borders, fringes, birds, supernatural beings, or human heads. Textiles could provide warmth, carry goods, identify social roles, decorate ritual spaces, wrap the dead, or serve as valuable gifts. Their importance was practical, economic, and ceremonial all at once. The dry southern coast preserved textiles that would have decayed quickly in wetter regions. This gives archaeologists an unusually detailed view of ancient techniques, though it does not tell us the name of the person who made a particular piece, or how long they spent correcting a stubborn section of thread. In ancient Peru, spinning and weaving were often associated with women, and the work could take place alongside other household responsibilities. Producing cloth was not a minor activity done only after the important work was finished. Cloth was important work. It required long practice, and finely made textiles could hold considerable social and ritual value. Clothing varied with status, occasion, age, and local custom. Some people wore simple garments suited to heat and work. Ceremonial participants could appear in more elaborate clothing, with painted faces, feather ornaments, head coverings, jewellery, or woven standards. Museum interpretations of Nazca art describe processions in which people carried offerings and musical instruments while dressed for public ritual. These images may not represent ordinary field clothing any more than a modern wedding photograph represents what everyone wears to buy bread. They do, however, show that appearance mattered during gatherings and that colour was used deliberately. Feathers were especially valuable because some came from birds living far beyond the coastal desert. Nazca pottery and ceremonial objects include images or materials connected with the rainforest, the highlands, and the sea. Camelid fibre, shells, feathers, and other goods move through exchange networks linking different ecological regions. Traders and travellers did not need a single paved highway to connect the Andes, coast, and eastern forests. Goods could pass through many hands and communities. A rare feather in a Nazca ceremony might therefore represent a long chain of journeys, agreements, and exchanges. It also suggests that the people of the valleys understood their world as larger than the desert visible from their own fields. Food and drink also helped bring communities together. Large gatherings required stored crops, serving vessels, cooking areas, and people willing to prepare far more food than usual. At Cahuachi, large quantities of pottery fragments and ceremonial materials suggest repeated public events. Some vessels may have held food or fermented drinks, while music, dance, offerings and feasting helped create a shared experience. A gathering could reinforce alliances, settle obligations, honour ancestors, request water, celebrate a harvest, or give local leaders an opportunity to appear especially well dressed, while everyone else tried not to spill anything. Cahuachi stood near the Nazca River and became the most important ceremonial centre during the early part of Nazca history, especially between about AD 50 and 300. Its adobe mounds, plazas, terraces and enclosed spaces covered a large area, but archaeologists have found little evidence that it functioned as a densely inhabited city. It appears to have been a pilgrimage and ceremonial centre visited by groups from surrounding valleys. People may have stayed temporarily in simple shelters or tents, bringing food, pottery, textiles and offerings with them. The larger spaces could accommodate substantial gatherings, and post holes suggest that canopies may have provided shade. This would have been welcome, because devotion is easier to maintain when the sun is not attempting to cook the entire congregation. The location of Cahuachi mattered. It stood between the Andes and the Pacific and near a place where reliable water gave the landscape special importance. Paths from the ceremonial centre connected with the surrounding geoglyph fields. This does not mean that Cahuachi controlled every line or every community, but it shows that religious gathering places, water, travel routes and desert markings belong to the same lived environment. A pilgrim arriving at Cahuachi did not separate religion from geography in the way a museum display might. The route, the river, the hills, the people, the offerings and the images on the ground were parts of one experience. Music was a visible part of Nazca ceremonial life. Archaeologists have recovered ceramic panpipes, drums, whistles, and vessels showing musicians or processions. Played by several people, panpipes may have created repeating patterns of sound across plazas or along routes in the desert. The open landscape would have carried those sounds differently from an enclosed room. Someone approaching a gathering might hear music before seeing the people who made it. The famous lines appear silent to modern visitors, but they may once have been crossed by groups whose footsteps, voices, whistles, drums and panpipes made silence rather difficult to arrange. Religious images often combined human, animal and plant features. One figure might have a human body, feline elements, serpentine appendages, large eyes, and a mouth that would make a dentist request an immediate second opinion. Scholars use modern labels such as the oculate being, anthropomorphic mythical being, or killer whale being to organise recurring designs. These names are useful for discussion, but they are not the original Nazca names. We do not know the stories told about these beings, the words spoken during ceremonies, or the exact relationships between different figures. Their repeated appearance on pottery and textiles shows that they mattered, yet the details remain uncertain. Ancestors and the dead also occupied an important place in Nazca ritual. Burials could include textiles, pottery, food, ornaments, and other offerings. The dry ground preserved some bodies naturally, while careful wrapping protected and displayed the dead. Ancestors may have been understood as active participants in community life, and as sources of fertility, authority, or protection. The British Museum notes that Paracas and Nazca traditions shared beliefs connecting ancestors with the supply of water and the continuation of life. In a region where water determined whether fields survived, the dead were not necessarily placed outside daily concerns. They could remain part of the social and religious system. Not every part of Nazca life was peaceful. Images and archaeological finds include so-called trophy heads, human heads modified for carrying or display, often with a hole through the forehead and the mouth closed or pinned. They appear repeatedly in art, held by people or supernatural beings attached to clothing or arranged as symbolic elements. Researchers have debated whether these heads came mainly from warfare, ritual combat, sacrifice, ancestor practices, or some combination of these. Museo Larco interprets them as connected with ritual battles and later ceremonies, while studies of individual remains show a more complicated picture. It is safest to say that controlled violence and the ritual treatment of human heads were real parts of Nazca society, but their meaning may have changed across time and place. This subject can feel sharply different from colourful pottery, music, farming, and family life. But ancient societies were not divided into a pleasant side and a mysterious side. The same community could produce fine cloth, raise children, maintain canals, honour the dead, and take part in violent conflict. Nazca art does not hide this. It places crops, animals, music, supernatural beings, and severed heads within the same visual system. That may be uncomfortable, yet it gives a fuller view of the culture than treating the people only as peaceful artists drawing birds in the sand. Environmental pressure increased over the centuries. Drought, changing river conditions, floods linked with major climate events, and possible earthquakes affected settlements and ceremonial centres. Kawachi declined as a major gathering place after the early Nazca period, and populations became more dispersed or shifted toward other centres. Political relationships also changed, and by later centuries new regional powers, including the Wari, influenced the southern coast. The end of Nazca culture was not one sudden disappearance. Styles changed, communities reorganised, and older traditions were absorbed into new ones. People did not wake one morning, notice that an archaeological period had ended, and politely replace all their pottery. Even during periods of change, the landscape continued to hold memory. Old paths remained visible. Earlier geoglyphs could be crossed by newer lines. Ceremonial places could be reused, abandoned, or understood differently by later communities. This long use is one reason the desert contains overlapping designs from different times. The people making a new line were not always working on untouched ground. They may have seen older marks, known stories about them, or chosen to place a new route near an established sacred point. UNESCO describes the geoglyph zone as a ritual and social landscape shaped by continuous activity over many centuries rather than one coordinated construction project. That broader setting changes the way the lines appear. They were not created by an unknown population that existed only long enough to clear stones and then vanish. They were made by communities with fields to maintain, cloth to weave, food to store, relatives to bury, music to play, and difficult decisions about water. Their artists already knew how to control lines on pottery and textiles. Their builders knew how to organise labour and shape adobe platforms. Their travellers knew the routes between valleys, hills, the coast and ceremonial centres. Enlarging a design across the desert was unusual in scale, but it drew upon familiar skills: measuring, planning, repeating patterns, reading the ground, and working together. Once we return to the open pampa with that daily life in mind, a straight line is no longer just a mark visible from a plane. It is also a route made by people who understood where the nearest river lay, which hill rose beyond the horizon, when the fields needed water and where others would gather. A hummingbird was not merely an attractive shape. Birds appeared on vessels, cloth, ornaments, and in beliefs connected with mountains, rain, and fertility. A broad trapezoid was not empty space. It may have held moving groups, offerings, or ceremonies tied to the same communities that visited Kawachi. The next step is to stand beside one of those markings and consider its size from the ground. At first, there may be no animal to see at all. There is only a cleared strip continuing ahead, bordered by darker stones. Follow it far enough, and the route begins to turn. Another section approaches from the side. The separate movements connect, and somewhere beyond the limits of a person's immediate view, a figure hundreds of times larger than the painted creatures on a bowl begins to take shape. From the edge of the pampa, the first thing you notice is not an animal, a bird, or a carefully planned geometric figure. You notice a pale strip of ground running away from you. Dark stones lie on either side while the centre has been cleared. The strip may be narrow enough to cross in a few steps, yet it continues so far that its purpose is not obvious. Walk beside it, and the view changes very little. The line remains a line. It does not suddenly announce that it belongs to a larger design. This is the first difficulty of understanding the Nazca geoglyphs. A person standing within them can see the work clearly, without being able to see what the work becomes. The famous designs occupy a broad desert landscape around Nazca and Palpa. UNESCO describes the main concentration as covering roughly 450 square kilometres, while the wider protected World Heritage property is larger. Across that ground are straight lines, triangles, rectangles, spirals, broad cleared areas, tracks, and figures representing animals, plants, people, and beings that are not easy to identify. Some straight lines continue for several kilometres. They cross the plain, climb low slopes, and meet other lines at angles that can make the desert resemble an enormous planning diagram whose labels have gone missing. The animal figures receive most of the attention because they are easy to remember. There is a hummingbird more than 300 feet long, along with a monkey, a spider, large birds, a whale or killer whale, and other forms. Yet these figures are only one part of the site. The majority of marks are lines and geometric shapes. A visitor who expects to find a neat outdoor gallery, with one animal politely separated from the next, soon discovers something much less orderly. Lines overlap. Trapezoids cut across older features. Routes continue beyond the visible figure. The surface records repeated activity rather than a single afternoon of desert drawing. Scale changes the way these designs can be understood. On a ceramic vessel, an artist can hold the object, turn it, and inspect the entire image. On a textile, the maker can see the border and the central pattern at the same time. A figure spread over a large area of desert is different. The makers had to organize a design that extended beyond ordinary vision. They needed to know where a curve should begin before they could see where it would end. They had to keep a long line straight while working at ground level. They also had to coordinate people so that one group did not produce a beautiful wing while another accidentally gave the bird the feet of a dining table. That sounds difficult, but it does not make the designs impossible. Builders have always worked on structures larger than their own field of view. A person laying a wall cannot see an entire building from every position. A road worker does not need to float above a highway to keep it on course. Surveying methods, reference points, chords, stakes, measurements, and smaller plans allow people to enlarge shapes and maintain direction. The Nazca makers had experience with controlled lines and repeated motifs on pottery and textiles. Moving those skills onto the ground required planning and labour, not an aircraft parked discreetly behind a hill. The simplest way to understand the visual problem is to imagine drawing a large circle in an open field. If the circle is only a few metres wide, you can step back and check it. If it is 100 metres wide, you cannot see the whole edge while standing beside it. You would mark a centre, use a cord of fixed length and walk around it. The result could be accurate even though no worker ever viewed the completed circle from directly above. Straight lines can be organised in a similar way by placing stakes at intervals and keeping them aligned with a distant point. Curves can be enlarged from a smaller design by using a grid or a sequence of measured points. Archaeologists have found stakes associated with some Nazca lines, and experimental work has repeatedly shown that teams using simple equipment can reproduce large figures. The exact method may not have been identical for every design, because the geoglyph tradition lasted for many centuries and involved different communities. Some figures were made as narrow outlines, others were formed by clearing broader areas. The central principle remained straightforward: remove the darker, weathered stones and expose the lighter ground beneath. In the dry climate, the contrast could remain visible long after the workers had gone home and complained that someone else had been assigned the easier end of the trapezoid. The title, "Lines Too Large for Human Eyes," therefore needs a small correction. The designs were not invisible to human eyes. Parts of them were visible from the ground, some could be viewed from nearby slopes, and their courses could be followed by walking. What was difficult was seeing an entire large figure from one low position. Modern aerial photographs give us a complete image immediately, but that may not have been the main way ancient people experienced the place. A line could matter as a path. A broad shape could matter as a gathering area. A figure could be known through a plan, a story, a ritual route, or repeated participation rather than through a single complete view. This difference is easy to overlook because nearly every modern introduction to Nazca begins with an aerial photograph. The camera looks down, the animal is instantly recognisable, and the viewer assumes that recognition was the purpose. Yet a modern photograph answers a modern question. What does the whole design look like from above? The people who made it may have asked different questions. Where does the route begin? Which hill does it face? Who walks along it? What happens at the end? Which group gathers here? What offering is carried? A complete overhead image is useful to us, but usefulness to us is not proof of importance to them. Peruvian archaeologist Toribio Mejia Gespe reported the lines in the 1920s after observing them from hills in the region. He later described them as sacred roads or ceremonial pathways. His ground-based observation is a useful reminder that the lines did not suddenly become visible only when pilots crossed the desert. Aviation changed how widely they could be photographed and studied, but elevated land already offered views across parts of the pampa. A person did not need to reach the height of a satellite. A hillside and a determined walk could reveal that ordinary-looking paths belonged to something larger. Aircraft did, however, transform public awareness. From the air, the long beak of a bird, the curled tail of the monkey, and the thin legs of the spider can be recognised in seconds. Straight lines that seem separate on the ground appear as a network. Broad trapezoids show their shape. Overlaps become obvious. A pilot can circle a figure while passengers lean toward one side of the cabin, usually with complete confidence that everyone else should move out of the way. Aerial viewing made the site easier to document, compare, and promote, but it also encouraged the idea that the images must have been designed for airborne spectators. That idea became one of the main sources of speculation. If the figures could best be seen from above, some writers argued, perhaps they were signals, landing grounds, or messages for visitors in the sky. The straight lines were compared with runways, even though many cross uneven terrain, vary in width, or end in ways that would be unhelpful to any pilot hoping for a calm arrival. More importantly, There is no archaeological evidence that the Nazca people built aircraft or received assistance from beings who did. The geoglyphs fit within known Andean practices of marking landscapes, making processional routes, creating ritual spaces, and using large public works to organise communities. The attraction of the airborne explanation comes partly from the gap between construction and viewing. We're accustomed to making images for direct observation. A mural faces a viewer, a statue stands where people can approach it, a painting fits within a frame. The Nazca designs do not always cooperate with that expectation. Their scale suggests that the completed shape was not meant to be consumed in one glance by every participant. This is not unique. Large gardens, city plans, ceremonial complexes, and agricultural terraces also form patterns that no single person sees completely while using them. Their meaning comes from movement through space, as well as observation of form. Walking changes the relationship again. A narrow line may guide one person or a small group. A broad track can hold many people. UNESCO distinguishes between representational figures and the great collection of straight or geometric lines, including tracks that appear capable of accommodating large numbers. If groups moved along these cleared surfaces, the line was not just an image. It was also a location for action. Feet followed its direction. Bodies occupied its width. Participants approached a hill, crossed a plain, entered a cleared area, or stopped where routes met. Archaeological research has connected many geoglyphs with ceremonial walking, offerings, and ritual activity. Pottery fragments and other materials found in association with lines suggest that at least some places were used rather than merely viewed. Recent research also distinguishes between large line-type figures linked with networks of straight lines and trapezoids, and smaller relief-type figures often placed near winding trails. The larger designs mostly represent wild animals and may have supported community-level rituals, while smaller figures showing people and domesticated animals may have been seen by individuals or small groups moving along paths. This distinction helps solve part of the viewing problem. Not every geoglyph worked in the same way. Some small figures could be recognised from nearby ground or slopes. Larger line-type designs may have been experienced through communal movement and knowledge of the complete form. A person taking part did not need to discover the image for the first time. They may already have known that a particular route traced a bird or surrounded a sacred area. The figure could exist in memory and speech while its separate sections appeared underfoot. We do something similar when travelling through a city whose map we know. We understand the shape of the route, even though buildings block most of it from view. The large geometric forms are especially important here. A trapezoid may widen gradually across the plain, sometimes pointing toward a hill or joining a group of lines. From above, it looks like a clear geometric object. From within it, the boundaries move farther apart as you walk. The shape changes the amount of space available and may control how a group spreads or gathers. Narrow beginnings can become broad open areas. Parallel lines can keep movement ordered. Radiating lines can connect one point with several destinations. The design is visible, but it also manages movement. There is no need to claim that every straight line was a procession route, or that every trapezoid held a ceremony. The site contains too many features, made across too much time, for one explanation to cover them all. Some lines may have linked important places. Others may have marked social divisions, water-related locations, astronomical directions, or repeated offerings. A design could also acquire new uses after its original purpose had faded. The important point is that size does not automatically mean the work was intended only for distant eyes. Size can also create a setting large enough for shared activity. Consider the labour required to clear a long line. Workers would move stones aside, maintain the edges, check the direction, and continue across ground that might look almost unchanged for hours. This labour was visible to other people. It required organisation and probably food, water, tools, and leadership. The making itself may have carried social value. A community could demonstrate cooperation by creating or renewing a route. Young participants could learn where it led and what it represented. Older designs could be revisited. Even if the full result was hard to see, everyone involved would know that the line existed because they had helped place it there. Overlapping lines support the idea of repeated return. In some areas, later features cross earlier ones with little attempt to preserve a clean composition. That would be a strange choice if the entire pampa were planned as one picture for a single viewer. It makes more sense as a landscape used by different communities and generations. New routes could matter more than keeping an older image perfectly readable. A line's relationship to a hill, a gathering point, or a ceremonial destination may have been more important than how tidy the whole area appeared from the air. UNESCO identifies this concentration and overlap as evidence of long, intensive activity rather than a one-time project. The animals themselves often use a single line method. Follow the outline and you may travel through the body, around the legs, along the head, and into a tail or beak without lifting an imaginary drawing tool. This continuous construction is well suited to marking a route on the ground. The line can be laid out as a sequence. Workers need to know the next turn rather than see the entire creature at once. A measured plan can guide each section. When finished, the animal becomes clear from above, but the production process remains manageable from below. The monkey is a good example of how scale and detail work together. Its body is relatively simple, while one hand has fewer fingers than the other, and the tail forms a large spiral. From the air, the spiral dominates the design. On the ground, it becomes a long curving passage. The maker's problem was not to produce tiny realistic detail, it was to select features that would survive enlargement. A curled tail, long beak, spread wings, or set of extended legs gives each figure a strong outline. The animals are recognizable because their forms have been simplified, much as a clear symbol on a sign avoids unnecessary detail. Even so, modern names can create false confidence. Researchers do not agree on every species. A bird called a condor in one source may be identified differently by an ornithologist studying its beak, neck, feet, or habitat. Some figures may combine features rather than represent a single animal precisely. Nazca artists were not preparing scientific illustrations for a field manual. Their aim may have involved religious associations, stories, environmental forces, or qualities linked with particular creatures. The image could be accurate in the way that mattered to its makers while remaining inconvenient for modern classification. The spider has attracted similar attention. Its thin legs and compact body make it easy to identify from above, but the exact species and symbolism remain debated. Popular accounts sometimes attach very specific meanings to it, especially connections with rain or fertility. Those links may be reasonable in a broader cultural context, yet the geoglyph itself does not provide a written explanation. It is better to recognize that the spider belonged to a visual world shared across pottery, textiles, ritual objects, and landscape designs. Its size tells us that people considered the form worth enlarging. It does not tell us every sentence they would have used to explain it. Modern survey methods have made the contrast between human sight and large landscapes even more obvious. Archaeologists now combine walking surveys with aerial photography, satellite images, drones, digital mapping, and computer analysis. Each method reveals something different. A satellite records broad patterns. A drone captures fine surface detail. A person on foot can examine stones, pottery fragments, erosion, and damage that may be unclear in an image. No single viewpoint is enough. The site that once exceeded the immediate view of its makers also exceeds the ability of one modern tool to explain it. Artificial intelligence has recently helped researchers examine large collections of aerial images and identify possible figures that human surveyors might overlook. In a study announced in 2024, a team from Yamagata University and IBM used AI to prioritize locations for field inspection. and confirmed 303 additional figurative geoglyphs during 6 months of fieldwork. Many were smaller relief-type designs near trails rather than the enormous line-type animals most people associate with Nazca. The discovery nearly doubled the number of confirmed figurative geoglyphs in the study area, and showed that the landscape still contains features difficult to recognise even after decades of aerial study. The computer did not replace archaeology. It suggested where people should look. Researchers still had to visit the locations, inspect the ground, separate human-made forms from natural marks, and record what they found. This combination is useful because the Pampa contains countless lines created by erosion, vehicles, foot traffic, and geology, as well as ancient work. A shape that resembles a person in a photograph may become an uncooperative patch of stones when examined closely. Computers are excellent at finding patterns, including patterns that turn out to be nothing. Human beings have been doing the same thing with clouds for a very long time. These newer discoveries also weaken the simple idea that all Nazca images were gigantic messages intended for the sky. The smaller relief-type figures often sit within viewing distance of ancient trails. Someone passing on foot could notice a human figure, a head, or a domesticated animal near the route. The larger line-type figures occupy different settings and may relate to broader ceremonial networks. Instead of one mysterious system with one hidden purpose, researchers now see categories of geoglyphs that differ in size, subject, location, and likely audience. Human vision therefore remains central to the story, but not in the obvious way. The makers use their eyes to align stakes, judge contrast, follow curves, and inspect the ground. Walkers use their eyes to stay within routes and recognise nearby figures. Observers on hills could see broader arrangements. Communities carried mental images that connected separate parts. Modern pilots, photographers, and satellite analysts added further viewpoints. The geoglyphs did not belong to a world without seeing. They belonged to a world in which seeing depended on position. Stand close to the hummingbird and its body breaks into sections of pale ground. Move to a slope and more of the outline becomes available. Rise in an aircraft and the bird appears at once. Examine a satellite image and it becomes one feature within a network extending far beyond it. Walk the line and the image becomes a route again. None of these views is false. Each answers a different question, and the mistake begins only when one view is treated as the only one that mattered. This is why the scale should not be reduced to a puzzle about how ancient people could draw something they could not fully see. The more useful question is how they planned, built, used, remembered, and renewed designs larger than individual vision. That question keeps the achievement human. It directs attention toward measurement, teamwork, landscape knowledge, and ritual practice. It also brings us closer to the workers themselves, standing beside stakes in the heat, checking a line against a distant marker, and trusting that many small actions would join into a form larger than any one of them. The next part of the trail begins there, at ground level, with the stones still in place and the pale soil hidden beneath them. Before an animal could stretch across the pampa, someone had to choose the site, prepare a plan, mark the first point, and decide exactly where the clearing should begin. The figures may be enormous, but their construction started with a very ordinary movement. A human hand lifting one dark stone from the desert surface. That first stone was small enough to hold in one hand. It had rested on the desert surface for centuries, exposed to sunlight, wind, and occasional moisture. Its upper surface had gradually become darker than the material below it. When a worker lifted it and moved it aside, a patch of pale ground appeared. The contrast was immediate. Repeat that movement several hundred times, keep the cleared strip within measured boundaries, and a visible line begins to cross the desert. This was the basic method used to create most of the Nazca geoglyphs. The makers did not carve deep trenches into solid rock. They removed the darker stones and gravel covering the surface, revealing lighter earth and bedrock underneath. The cleared material was often placed along the edges, which made the boundaries more noticeable and helped define the shape. The work required time and organisation, but the technology itself was simple. There was no need for metal blades, heavy vehicles, or machinery that made a loud beeping noise whenever it moved backwards. The dark coating on the surface stones is often called desert varnish. It forms slowly as exposed rocks react with minerals, dust, moisture, and microorganisms. The precise chemistry can vary from place to place, but the important feature for the Nazca makers was easy to observe. Stones left on the surface were darker, the material beneath them was lighter. By rearranging the upper layer, people could produce a strong difference in colour without adding any new substance to the ground. The workers did not need to remove much material. They were changing the appearance of the surface rather than excavating deeply into it. A shallow clearing could remain visible because the region receives very little rainfall and supports limited vegetation. Roots did not quickly break through the lines, and regular storms did not wash the pale surface away every season. The extreme dryness that made life difficult for local communities also gave their work an unusually long life. UNESCO identifies this aridity as one of the main reasons the designs have remained visible for close to 2,000 years. Before any clearing began, however, someone had to decide what would be made. A straight route required a starting point and a destination. A trapezoid needed boundaries. A spiral required a centre and a controlled curve. An animal figure needed proportions that would remain recognisable after being enlarged across an area much greater than the original model. No Nazca construction manual survives, and the people who made the lines left no written explanation of their measuring system. Archaeologists therefore work from the physical evidence, comparisons with other Nazca art, and practical experiments. Wooden stakes have been found in connection with some lines. Cords stretched between stakes could have created reliable guides for workers. A pair of parallel cords would mark the two edges of a straight strip. People could then clear the stones between them while supervisors checked that the direction remained correct. A straight line across level ground may sound like the easiest design, but maintaining its direction over a long distance requires care. From close range, a small error may not look serious. Continue that error for several kilometres, and the line can wander far from its intended destination. The makers could reduce this problem by aiming at a distant hill, ridge, or marked point. Stakes placed at intervals would help preserve the direction when the far end became difficult to see. The work could proceed in stages. One group marked the route, another cleared the centre, other workers carried stones to the sides or arranged them along the borders. Someone had to bring water and food, especially if the work took place far from cultivated land. Tools would have been modest: wooden stakes, cords, baskets, digging sticks, and human hands. Most surface stones were small enough to move without special equipment, although larger pieces sometimes required more than one person. A long line did not necessarily have to be completed in one session. A community could return over several days, weeks, or seasons. Certain routes may also have been repaired or cleared again after their original construction. Foot traffic could keep part of a surface open, while wind-blown material and displaced stones might require occasional attention. The finished design was therefore not only the result of the first construction effort, it may also reflect years of use and maintenance. Broad geometric forms required a slightly different approach. For a trapezoid, workers could mark the outer edges with stakes and cords, then remove much of the darker gravel from the area between them. The cleared stones were placed along the borders or gathered into piles. Archaeologists have found broken pottery among some of these stone piles, suggesting that construction, use, and ceremonial deposits could occur in the same places. The largest geometric forms demanded far more labour than a narrow line because entire areas had to be cleared. Even then, the job was not beyond the abilities of a well-organised community. The surface layer was loose, the stones were portable, and large numbers of workers could clear separate sections at the same time. The The task was repetitive rather than technically mysterious. Imagine being assigned a strip several meters wide. You begin at one marked end and move slowly forward, picking up dark stones and carrying them to the border. Another person works beside you. Behind the group, the pale surface extends farther each hour. From the ground, the result may not seem dramatic. You see a cleared patch and a pile of stones. From a nearby slope, the growing form becomes easier to understand. The labour itself may have been socially important. Constructing a geoglyph brought people together, required cooperation, and produced a lasting mark associated with a community or ceremonial group. Smart history notes that organised labour may have strengthened social unity. A shared project could demonstrate that a group was capable of mobilising workers, providing food, and maintaining relationships across households or settlements. Not everyone involved needed to understand every measurement. A small number of planners could set out the main points while a larger workforce followed the marked boundaries. This is common in large construction projects. A person carrying bricks does not need to calculate the roof angle. A worker clearing stones did not need to keep the complete hummingbird in mind during every movement. They needed to know which stones belonged inside the marked route and where those stones should be placed. Creating curves required additional control, but chords made that possible as well. A simple circle can be made by fixing one end of a cord to a central stake and walking the other end around it. Keep the cord tight, and the distance from the centre remains constant. A spiral can be produced by gradually changing the cord's length, or by setting a sequence of measured points that move farther from the centre with each turn. Smart history suggests that some Nazca spirals could have been created by allowing more cord to extend as workers moved around a central point. This method would have been especially useful for the monkey's large curled tail and for independent spiral designs. One person could manage the cord while others marked or cleared the route. The curve would expand in an orderly way even though no one standing beside it could see the entire shape at once. Animal figures presented a more complicated problem because they included many different curves, angles, and changes of direction. One likely method was to begin with a smaller image. The design might be drawn on cloth, scratched into a surface, painted on pottery, or arranged as a measured plan. A grid could then divide the small image into sections. A much larger grid marked on the desert would allow each section to be copied at an increased scale. Suppose the original drawing of a bird fits within a grid 10 squares wide and 6 squares tall. The makers could create a larger grid in which every square measured several meters across. A curve passing through the lower corner of one small square would be placed in the matching position within the larger square. The process would not require a person to judge the complete bird from memory. Each part could be transferred separately. There is no surviving grid visible around every Nazca animal, so this remains a practical reconstruction rather than a confirmed instruction from the makers. Chords, stakes, measured points, or combinations of these methods could all have been used. The important fact is that large-scale enlargement is possible with tools the Nazca people possessed. Archaeological and experimental studies have shown that complex geoglyphs can be reproduced with organised labour and straightforward measurement. The artists already understood how to simplify animals into strong outlines. Nazca pottery and textiles contain birds, fish, felines, plants, human beings, and supernatural figures built from controlled shapes and repeated lines. A desert geoglyph did not require detailed feathers, fur, or facial expressions. It required features that would remain clear at great scale. A long beak, spread wings, thin legs, a curled tail, or a distinctive body shape. Many famous animal geoglyphs were formed with a single continuous line. The outline moves around the figure without crossing itself. Someone following the hummingbird's contour could travel around the beak, head, wings, tail, and body before returning to the starting area. This quality may have made planning easier, but it may also have supported walking or ritual use. Smart history observes that the contour designs can be traversed as continuous routes, and that pottery and food remains found nearby indicate repeated visits. Construction and use were therefore not necessarily separate. The first clearing created the route. Later walking could reinforce it. A ceremony might include movement along the line, stopping at particular points, placing offerings, or approaching the figure from an attached straight path. Some animal designs connect directly with longer lines, suggesting that participants could move from a broad landscape route into the outline of a recognizable creature. Not every figure was made with the same technique. Researchers distinguish between line-type geoglyphs and relief-type geoglyphs. The famous large animals are often line-type designs, formed with narrow, cleared outlines. Many recently documented smaller figures are relief-type designs, made by removing stones from broader parts of the figure so that the body itself appears as a light area. These smaller designs are frequently located near ancient trails and include human forms, camelids, heads, and other subjects connected with everyday or ritual activity. A relief-type figure could be made almost like a simple silhouette. Workers outlined the body and cleared stones from selected sections inside it. Darker stones might remain to define details or separate parts. Because many of these figures are less than 10 meters across, a nearby traveller could recognize them without climbing to a high viewpoint. Their construction may have involved fewer workers and less formal surveying than the largest line-type animals. This variety warns against imagining one official Nazca design office issuing identical instructions across the region. Geoglyph making continued for centuries. Different communities worked in different areas. Techniques developed, subjects changed, and new figures were placed near older ones. Some designs were carefully set out on open plains, others appeared on slopes or beside winding trails. The makers adapted their methods to the ground, the intended size, and the way people would encounter the result. The surface itself influenced every decision. A flat plain offered space for long lines and wide trapezoids. A hillside made a smaller figure visible from below. Rocky ground might require more clearing. Natural channels, ridges, or areas vulnerable to flooding had to be considered. The builders were not drawing on an empty sheet. They were working with a landscape that already contained slopes, stones, paths, river courses, and earlier designs. Occasional rainfall associated with strong El Niño events could send water across normally dry areas. Lines placed in active drainage channels would be at greater risk, while those on stable terraces could survive. UNESCO describes the principal geoglyph zone as a Pleistocene alluvial terrace, with only occasional water activity. Its stable surface and very low rainfall helped preserve the designs. Wind also behaves differently in this part of the desert than many people expect. The lines are not constantly buried under high dunes. Much of the pampa is a firm gravel surface. Loose sand can move, but the stones help protect the lighter material below. Once the darker stones were placed along a line's edges, they may have reduced some movement across the cleared area. The dry climate did the rest by limiting plant growth and erosion. This preservation can make the designs look as though they were created once and then left untouched. The overlapping evidence shows otherwise. Newer lines cross older forms. Some geometric shapes cut through previous routes without preserving them. UNESCO considers this concentration and overlap evidence of intense activity over a long period. The makers may not have regarded every older line as a work that must never be disturbed. A new ceremony, social group, destination, or religious practice could require a different route. An older marking might remain respected but no longer serve the same purpose. In other cases, workers may have deliberately connected a new design with an established place. Dating these surface features is difficult because the lines themselves contain little organic material. A stone moved aside does not come with a date attached. Researchers study pottery found nearby, relationships between overlapping lines, settlement history, and materials buried during construction. Optically stimulated luminescence has also been used at some sites to estimate when mineral grains were covered. One study of geometric lines near Palpa dated construction at selected locations to between about AD 400 and 650, showing that line making continued into later Nazca times. The dates vary because the geoglyph tradition did not belong to a single moment. Some hillside figures are linked with earlier Paracas communities. Many large line-type designs belong to Nazca periods. Other marks may have been added later. The complete landscape developed through repeated construction rather than one centrally planned campaign. Accuracy is another part of the achievement. Some straight lines continue across uneven ground with very little change in direction. This has encouraged claims that the makers required advanced instruments. In practice, long sight lines can be produced with basic surveying. Place 2 stakes in alignment, sight along them, add a third farther away, and repeat. A distant hill can serve as an additional reference. The process is slow, but slowness is not the same as impossibility. The same applies to symmetry. A bird's wings can be laid out by measuring equal distances from a central body line. Matching points can be placed on each side with chords. If the design is not perfectly symmetrical, that may reflect deliberate stylization, small measuring differences, or changes made during construction. Modern viewers sometimes expect machine-level perfection from the ground, while happily accepting a slightly uneven handmade cup in a kitchen. A mistake could also be corrected. A misplaced stake might be moved before clearing began. A shallow line made in the wrong place could be covered again with dark stones, though traces might remain. Workers could inspect the design from nearby higher ground and adjust an awkward curve. The presence of hills around parts of the region gave planners opportunities to review more of a figure than was visible from the surface. No aircraft was needed, but imagination was. The planners had to understand that a series of local measurements would create a recognizable whole. This ability is familiar in many forms of ancient construction. Monumental buildings, roads, irrigation systems, terraces, and large earthworks all depend on people coordinating work beyond the view of one individual. The desert designs may actually have required less labour than some stone buildings. The makers did not quarry blocks, transport them for kilometres, or raise them onto high walls. They rearranged material already lying at the site. A modest team could make a small figure quickly, while a large geometric form would require a greater community effort. The difference lay in scale rather than technology. Once built, the designs had to survive human activity as well as nature. Walking along an intended route may have helped define it, but crossing the edges carelessly could disturb them. Wheels are particularly destructive because they crush stone borders and leave tracks that remain visible for years. The South Pan American Highway cut through sections of the protected landscape, and UNESCO records damage to some lines and figures caused by its construction. Modern conservation therefore relies on restricting access, monitoring vulnerable areas, recording designs, and providing controlled viewpoints. The strange result is that works probably created through human movement must now be protected from too much human movement. A few ancient walkers could use a route without causing the kind of damage produced by a vehicle crossing it once. Archaeologists documenting a geoglyph work almost in reverse. The Nazca makers began with a plan and placed it onto the ground. Modern researchers begin with the ground and try to recover the plan. They map stone borders, study surface colour, inspect intersections, compare photographs, and walk the route. A faint change that means little from one direction may become a leg, wing, or human arm when seen from another. Drones, aircraft, and satellite images now make large-scale mapping faster, but field inspection remains essential. The ground contains natural patterns, modern tracks, and damaged features that can resemble ancient designs from above. Researchers must confirm whether stones were deliberately moved and whether a suspected figure fits known construction practices. The large AI-assisted survey announced by Yamagata University in 2024 used aerial imagery to identify likely locations. But archaeologists still examine those places in person before confirming 303 additional figures. Those discoveries show how subtle the construction can be. A large hummingbird is difficult to miss in a clear aerial image. A small, weathered relief figure beside an old trail may blend with the surrounding ground. The same basic act of moving dark stones can produce a bold line or a faint body shape depending on the design, age, surface, and viewing angle. For the original makers, that variation was probably intentional. A huge animal connected with broad lines could support a public ceremony involving many people. A small figure beside a trail could communicate with travellers passing close by. A wide trapezoid could hold a gathering. A narrow route could guide movement. Construction methods, size, location, and use belong together. Seen at ground level, the process becomes understandable. A planner marks 2 points. A cord is stretched. Workers clear the stones. Another line branches away. A curve begins around a stake. The pale route grows longer. Nothing in an individual movement seems impossible or even particularly mysterious. The extraordinary result comes from repetition, measurement, cooperation, and the decision to make an image larger than one person could easily see. That decision raises a more interesting question than how the stones were moved. The Nazca people could have made simple lines without turning them into creatures. They could have cleared practical paths without giving a monkey a spiral tail or a bird a beak stretching across the plain. They chose particular bodies, plants, and beings from a much larger world of possible designs. Once the cords were removed and the workers stepped back, the construction method disappeared into the finished outline. What remained was a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, a whale, or another creature resting across the dry ground. The stones explain how those forms were made, but the forms themselves lead toward the animals the Nazca people knew, imagined, painted, feared, valued, and carried with them into the desert. Once the stones had been cleared and the lines had taken shape, the desert began to hold creatures that did not normally live there. A hummingbird stretched across the plain at a length of more than 300 feet. A monkey appeared with a tightly curled tail. A spider spread thin legs over an area larger than many houses. Birds with long beaks, marine animals, dogs, plants, and unfamiliar beings joined them. They were surrounded by straight routes and geometric forms that crossed the pampa in almost every direction. The animals may be the most recognizable part of the Nazca landscape today, but they are also some of its most difficult features to interpret. Modern names make the figures sound more certain than they really are. We call one design the hummingbird, another the condor, another the spider, and another the monkey. These labels are convenient because a pilot needs something more useful to say than, "There is a large shape on the left that may represent a bird of some kind." Yet the Nazca people did not leave written captions beside the figures. We do not know what names they used, which species they intended, or whether every creature was supposed to represent an ordinary animal at all. Nazca artists were comfortable combining features from different parts of the natural world. Their pottery, textiles, and metal ornaments show humans with animal traits, birds joined with feline features, marine creatures carrying human heads, and supernatural beings that resist simple classification. A figure might include parts of several animals because its meaning came from that combination. Modern researchers can describe the beak, feet, wings, or tail, but the original story behind those features has not survived in words. The large bird commonly called the hummingbird is a good place to begin. Its long, narrow beak extends far ahead of a small head. Straight wings spread to either side, while an elongated tail points behind it. The outline is simple enough to recognize immediately from the air. There are no tiny feathers, shaded colours, or careful attempts to show the soft round body of a real bird. Those details would have been difficult to produce and almost impossible to appreciate at such scale. Instead, the makers selected the features that mattered most: the long bill, the spread wings, and the extended tail. Hummingbirds were familiar in Nazca art. A surviving ceramic bottle in the Metropolitan Museum of Art shows hummingbirds feeding from flowers. Their thin beaks are placed directly against blossoms, making the relationship between bird and plant clear. The vessel dates from roughly the first 4 centuries of the Common Era and demonstrates that these birds appeared in ritual objects as well as on the desert floor. Nazca painted pottery carried religious knowledge and was used during feasts, processions, funerary offerings and public ceremonies, so an animal shown on a vessel could have meanings beyond simple decoration. Hummingbirds would have been easy animals to notice. They move quickly, hover in place, disappear and return. Their beaks allow them to reach flowers that many other creatures cannot use. In a dry region where plant growth depended on water and season, the sight of hummingbirds feeding among fresh blossoms may have been associated with renewal or fertility. That connection is plausible, but it should not be treated as a translation of Nazca belief. We have the image, the environmental setting, and repeated appearances in art. We do not have a Nazca speaker explaining exactly what the bird meant. Even the identification of the famous geoglyph has been questioned. A 2019 ornithological study examined 16 bird figures on the Nazca Pampa and compared their visible features with modern Peruvian bird groups. The researchers concluded that the design traditionally called a hummingbird more closely resembles a hermit, a subgroup of hummingbirds that lives mainly in humid tropical environments. Its extremely long bill and elongated central tail were among the features supporting that identification. The same study identified other geoglyphs as probable pelicans and suggested that another may show an immature parrot. That finding is interesting because hermits and parrots do not belong to the coastal desert around Nazca. They are associated with tropical forest environments far to the east. Pelicans belong to the Pacific coast rather than the inland pampa. According to the researchers, the bird figures they could identify represented creatures from regions outside the immediate desert. This suggests that distance may have contributed to their importance. The makers were not simply recording whichever bird happened to be standing nearby while they planned the design. The Nazca people participated in exchange networks that reached the highlands, the coast, and areas connected with the Amazonian forests. Feathers, shells, fibers, stone, plants, and other materials could move through many communities before reaching the southern valleys. Nazca pottery also shows rainforest birds, while exotic feathers appeared in ritual dress and ornaments. A creature could be known through trade, travel, stories, feathers, preserved remains, or images, even if most local people had never seen it alive. An unfamiliar animal may have carried associations with the place from which it came. A tropical bird could point mentally toward a wetter world of dense vegetation, rivers, and regular rainfall. A pelican could call attention toward the ocean, fish, and the coastal communities that supplied marine food. Drawing such creatures in the desert may have brought several ecological regions together within one ritual landscape. The Pampa stood between the Pacific and the Andes, and the animals placed upon it could represent relationships extending far beyond the plain itself. The monkey makes that distance even clearer. Monkeys do not naturally inhabit the dry southern coast of Peru. Their home lies on the eastern side of the Andes and within tropical forests. Even so, monkeys appear in Nazca art. The Metropolitan Museum holds a Nazca vessel shaped like a female monkey, possibly a black spider monkey or a woolly monkey. White bands around its neck and waist may represent cords, leading the museum to suggest that the animal could have been kept as a pet. It holds an object that may be a fruit or a cob of maize. The vessel proves that the monkey was not invented only for the geoglyph. Nazca artists had observed or inherited enough information to represent its body, head, and heavy tail. A living monkey might have reached the coast through exchange, though it would have required care during a long journey. Monkeys could also have been known through skins, bones, stories, or images passed between regions. Whatever the route, the animal became part of Nazca visual culture. The desert monkey has a rounded body, long limbs, large hands, and a tail that curls inward in a broad spiral. One hand appears to have 5 fingers and the other fewer, though erosion and stylization make exact counting less useful than it first appears. The tail dominates the figure. If the monkey's body had been designed with a modest straight tail, it would still be recognizable. but it would lose the feature that gives the geoglyph much of its character. Spirals appear elsewhere in Nazca designs, both as independent geoglyphs and as elements within larger figures. Some scholars have connected spiral forms with shells, water, movement, or underground channels. These suggestions are reasonable because water was central to Nazca life, but a spiral does not carry a single meaning in every location. It can also be an effective way to fill space, show a curled animal tail, or create a route that turns gradually inward. The monkey's tail may have worked on several levels at once. A person walking along that tail would experience it as a long curve that slowly tightens. The complete monkey would remain beyond immediate sight, but the walker would feel the repeated turning. If the figure was used ceremonially, the movement itself may have mattered. It could control pace, keep participants together, or bring them toward a central point. No surviving evidence allows us to describe the exact ritual, yet the form was clearly suitable for movement, as well as distant viewing. The spider is more delicate. Its body occupies little space compared with the reach of its legs. Each leg is formed by a narrow line, giving the figure an appearance that is surprisingly precise when seen from above. The design extends for more than 300 feet, but a person standing beside one leg would see only a cleared route running across the stones. Popular accounts often claim that the figure represents a particular spider connected with rain, fertility, or the arrival of wet weather. Some go even further and identify a rare species from distant regions. These statements are usually presented with more confidence than the evidence allows. The geoglyph is stylized, and the number, angle, and form of its limbs may reflect artistic decisions rather than a scientific attempt to preserve anatomical detail. Spiders would nevertheless have been meaningful creatures in an agricultural society. They appear when insects are available, build ordered webs, and can seem to vanish into small spaces. Their webs depend on tension and repeated lines, qualities that may have appealed to people who worked with thread and produced complex textiles. This does not prove that the Nazca spider symbolized weaving, rainfall, or any other particular idea. It simply explains why the animal could attract attention without needing assistance from an especially imaginative documentary narrator. The comparison with weaving is still useful on a practical level. Nazca textile makers understood how individual threads create a larger pattern. The complete design emerges from repeated small actions that may seem unimportant on their own. The desert spider was made in a similar way. Each cleared section formed part of a body too large to inspect from one ground level position. The people who created both textiles and geoglyphs were accustomed to working within planned patterns. Birds form the largest group among the well-known animal geoglyphs. The 2019 ornithological study noted that bird figures outnumber other plant and animal subjects on the pampa. Their abundance may reflect the variety of environments birds could connect. Some live near the ocean, others belong to river valleys, mountains, wetlands, or tropical forests. Birds also move between earth and sky, appeared and disappeared with seasons, and travelled farther than most land animals. The figure traditionally called the condor is one of several cases where an established name may not be secure. Its broad wings encourage the identification, but different researchers have proposed other birds for some of the large designs. Long beaks, neck shapes, tails, and feet do not always match the species named in tour guides. The 2019 study found that several traditional identifications relied mainly on general appearance rather than careful comparison of physical features. This does not make the old names useless. Condor is easier to remember than large bird figure whose species remains disputed. It simply reminds us that modern labels belong to modern observation. A Nazca artist may have exaggerated one feature because it carried symbolic value. The finished design might also represent a category of bird rather than one exact species. A long beak could be more important than the correct arrangement of toes. Pelicans are especially interesting because they connect the inland desert with the Pacific. The ocean was a major source of food and wealth for coastal Andean communities, but it was also dangerous and unpredictable. Nazca art frequently includes fish, sharks, killer whales, seabirds, and other marine subjects. A painted vessel at the Metropolitan Museum shows a seated person with a long-beaked bird on one arm and a marine creature on the other, placing sea life directly onto the human body. The geoglyph often called the whale, or killer whale, belongs to this marine world. Its identification can vary because the outline is highly stylized. It has a powerful body and features that suggest a large sea animal, rather than a creature from the desert valleys. Killer whales also appear in Nazca ceramic imagery, sometimes transformed into supernatural beings and shown with human heads or weapons. Marine creatures were not treated as background scenery. They could be active, dangerous figures within religious art. Drawing a marine animal on the dry pampa may seem contradictory until the landscape is viewed as a meeting place between regions. The Nazca people lived between the ocean and the mountains. Fish and shellfish travelled inland. Crops and textiles travelled outward. Rivers began in the Andes and moved toward the sea, though some flows disappeared before reaching it. A whale on the desert surface connected the driest part of the landscape with the largest body of water the people knew. There is also a figure commonly called the dog. Dogs appear in archaeological contexts and Nazca imagery, including a ceramic procession scene described by the British Museum in which 5 human figures carrying instruments and offerings are accompanied by 5 dogs. Dogs could travel with people, guard settlements, assist with hunting, consume scraps, and join public activity whether anyone had formally invited them or not. A dog geoglyph would therefore differ from a monkey or tropical bird. It represented an animal present in human communities, rather than one imported from a distant ecological zone. Its inclusion shows that rarity alone did not determine which creatures entered the desert. Familiar animals could also hold ceremonial, social, or symbolic importance. Plants appear among the figures as well. UNESCO's description of the site includes flowers, trees, and stylized vegetation alongside animals and imaginary beings. Plant images receive less attention because most viewers naturally prefer a monkey with a spiral tail to something that may be a branch. Yet crops and wild plants were essential to Nazca survival, medicine, textile production, food, and ritual. Some designs have been identified as trees or flowers, although their exact species are difficult to establish. As with the birds, the Nazca makers may have highlighted useful or recognizable features rather than providing a complete botanical portrait. A plant could represent food, seasonal growth, cultivated land, or a substance used in ceremonies. It could also be part of a larger story that is now unavailable to us. Human figures are relatively rare among the large geoglyphs in the central protected landscape, though many smaller anthropomorphic figures have been documented in the wider Nazca and Palpa region. UNESCO notes that representational geoglyphs include only a small number of human forms compared with animals and geometric designs. Some human-like figures are simple, others have large eyes, unusual headdresses, or bodies that are difficult to separate from supernatural imagery. Modern nicknames can make these figures sound stranger than they are. One hillside image is frequently called an astronaut because of its rounded head and large eyes. The name encourages people to interpret the figure through helmets and space travel, although the image was produced within a culture whose art already included masks, headdresses, wide eyes, and composite beings. A human-like form does not become evidence of a visitor from space simply because it looks unusual to someone accustomed to modern clothing. Nazca ceramic figures often wear elaborate nose ornaments, diadems, masks, and decorated garments. The British Museum describes a major supernatural figure known to modern scholars as the mythical being, whose human-like form incorporates animal traits and prominent facial ornaments. The Metropolitan Museum similarly identifies a recurring masked being with large eyes, feline whiskers, rich clothing, weapons, and human heads. These examples show that unusual bodies and faces were established elements of Nazca religious imagery. The geoglyph figures should therefore be read beside portable art rather than in isolation. A bird on the pampa belongs to the same broad visual world as a bird painted on a vessel. A monkey scratched into the desert can be compared with a monkey-shaped bottle. Marine animals, plants, masks, and mixed beings recur in several materials. The scale changes, but the subjects do not arrive from nowhere. Pottery offers more detail because artists could use colour, interior lines, repeated patterns, teeth, eyes, clothing, and objects held in the hands. A geoglyph strips most of that information away. It relies on outline. This process of reduction may make an ordinary animal look unfamiliar. Remove colour from a parrot, enlarge it across a field, and simplify its feathers into a few lines, and even an experienced birdwatcher may need a moment. The figures were not copied mechanically from pottery. Desert outlines use the possibilities of the ground. Long legs become paths, a tail becomes a spiral, wings create balanced extensions, beaks lead into straight lines. Some figures connect with roots that continue well beyond the body. Their makers adapted familiar imagery to a medium that people could walk through. Scale also changed the social experience of the image. A decorated pot could be held by one person, carried into a gathering, placed in a grave, or used to serve a drink. A geoglyph belonged to a place. To encounter it, people had to travel to the pampa. To maintain it, they had to return. To create it, several households or a larger community may have needed to cooperate. The choice of an animal may have helped identify the group responsible for a particular design. Some archaeologists have suggested that different communities or social groups maintained separate geoglyphs. A bird, monkey, or marine animal could have served as a shared emblem, though direct evidence for named animal clans is limited. The idea remains possible because repeated public work often strengthens group identity. Imagine several communities arriving on the pampa for a gathering. One group moves toward a bird figure, another follows a route connected with a trapezoid. People recognize the designs through prior knowledge even when they cannot see them completely. The animals organize memory and place. Someone can say where an event will happen by naming the creature associated with the location. Children could learn these places by walking them. Older participants might explain which route to follow, where to stop, and what offering to carry. The complete figure exists in shared understanding. Nobody needs to climb into the sky to confirm that the monkey still has a tail. Animal behaviour may also have influenced ceremonial meaning. Birds migrate, fish appear in changing numbers, spiders build webs, monkeys move through distant forests, and hummingbirds arrive where flowers open. Each creature participates in environmental cycles. People whose survival depended on seasonal water and successful crops paid close attention to changes in animals and plants. The Nazca world did not separate nature into the modern categories of useful wildlife, religious symbolism, artistic design, and scientific observation. A bird could be food, a sign of seasonal change, a source of feathers, a messenger in a story, and a figure painted on ceremonial pottery. These roles could exist together without contradiction. That is why assigning a single meaning to each geoglyph is risky. The hummingbird was not necessarily only a symbol of rain. The monkey was not necessarily only a sign of distant trade. The spider was not necessarily only connected with weaving. Meanings could vary between communities and change across generations. The same animal might be interpreted differently in a procession, burial, origin story, or request for water. Researchers can still make useful observations. Birds dominate the known animal figures. Several appear to represent species from distant environments. Monkeys connect the coast with eastern forests. Marine creatures connect the pampa with the Pacific. Similar subjects appear in pottery, textiles, and metalwork. The figures were created within a religious and social landscape, rather than as isolated decoration. These conclusions are supported by physical evidence, even when the exact stories remain unknown. New discoveries continue to enlarge the collection. Smaller geoglyphs identified through aerial surveys and later confirmed on the ground include people, camelids, birds, cats, and other forms. Their subjects and locations differ from the famous large line-type animals. Many lie beside ancient trails, where travellers could have seen them at close range. The growing number of figures suggests that making images on the ground was not reserved for a few monumental animals. It was a broad practice carried out at several scales. The famous hummingbird, monkey, and spider survive partly because their outlines are clear and their shapes appeal to modern viewers. They appear on postcards, signs, jewellery, clothing, and logos. This popularity can make them seem like the official representatives of Nazca culture, selected by an ancient tourism committee with unusually good instincts. In reality, they are a small sample from a much larger landscape of creatures, objects, lines, and paths. Their modern fame also changes how they are seen. We encounter them as complete aerial images, usually separated from surrounding routes. A photograph may remove other lines from the frame so that the animal appears alone and easy to understand. On the actual pampa, it belongs to a crowded surface containing overlaps, geometric shapes, roads, natural marks, and signs of repeated human movement. Return the animal to that setting, and it becomes part of an activity rather than simply a picture. A bird lies near routes that people may have walked. A monkey's tail creates a spiral path. A marine creature brings the ocean onto dry ground. A tropical bird introduces a distant wet environment. The animals help organise relationships among people, places, and resources. Water runs through many of those relationships. Hummingbirds depend on flowering plants. Monkeys come from forested regions. Pelicans and whales belong to the sea. Crops need irrigation. Human gatherings require stored water and food. The animals do not all represent water in the same direct way, but they belong to a world shaped by its presence, absence, movement, and seasonal return. The next lines we follow do not end at an animal's wing or tail. They extend toward hills, river valleys, gathering areas, and places where offerings were left. Pottery fragments appear beside stone piles. Paths converge on raised points. Broad cleared spaces seem large enough to hold groups of people. The creatures show us what the Nazca people chose to place on the ground, while the roots around them begin to show what people may have done there. A hummingbird can be admired as a giant drawing, but it becomes more informative when we ask who approached it, what they carried, and why they returned. Those questions lead away from identifying species and toward the practical concern that shaped life throughout the southern valleys. Beyond the wings, legs, tails, and beaks lies the continuing search for water, and the ceremonies that may have turned that search into a shared journey across the desert. The animal figures draw the eye first, but the roots around them lead back to the problem that shaped nearly every part of life on the southern coast of Peru. Water. The Nazca people lived in one of the driest regions on Earth. Rain rarely fell on the coastal plain, and the rivers that crossed it depended on seasonal rainfall much farther east in the Andes. When water descended from the mountains, it could feed canals, fields, and settlements. When it failed to arrive in sufficient quantity, crops, animals, and households faced immediate pressure. For the Nazca, water was not an interesting subject to discuss after the harvest. It was the condition that made a harvest possible at all. The valleys cut narrow green corridors through the desert. Maize, beans, cotton, and other crops could grow where irrigation carried water into prepared fields. Beyond those cultivated areas, the pampas remained dry and stony. This contrast helps explain why hills, river channels, springs, and routes toward the mountains could become important in both practical and religious life. A line directed toward a highland ridge was not pointing at an empty background. It was pointing toward the region from which the rivers received their water. Modern explanations sometimes separate irrigation from religion, as though one group of Nazca people handled canals while another group stood nearby thinking about sacred matters. Their lives probably did not follow such a clean division. Water could be measured, directed, and shared, but it could never be guaranteed. People could clear a canal and prepare a field correctly, and still depend on rainfall occurring many kilometres away. That uncertainty gave water a social and ceremonial importance alongside its obvious practical value. The British Museum notes that Paracas and Nazca communities believed ancestors played a role in ensuring supplies of water and food. The dead were not understood simply as people who had left the community and become irrelevant. They could become intermediaries between living families and powerful forces connected with fertility and survival. Offerings, funerary practices, images of supernatural beings, and ceremonies tied the living, the ancestors, and the landscape together. This helps explain why the desert itself could become a sacred setting. The open pampa was not useful farmland, yet it lay between the irrigated valleys, the Pacific coast, and the Andean foothills. Nazca communities marked it with roots, figures, gathering spaces, and areas where objects were deposited. UNESCO describes the geoglyph zone as a symbolic, ritual, and social landscape created through long and repeated activity. The landscape mattered as a connected whole, not merely as a collection of separate pictures. Some straight lines point generally toward hills or mountains, others radiate from raised points often called ray centres. Broad trapezoids widen across the ground, while groups of lines converge near mounds or natural prominences. Researchers have proposed that some of these arrangements referred to water sources, underground flows, or mountain places associated with rainfall. No single pattern explains every line, but the repeated relationship between geoglyphs, elevated places, river valleys, and ceremonial activity makes water one of the strongest themes in current interpretations. A line did not need to sit directly above a channel to be connected with water. It could indicate a direction, create a route toward a sacred location, or support a ceremony requesting seasonal flow. It might also identify the community responsible for maintaining a particular area. A modern map usually marks where something is. A ritual landscape can also mark how people should approach it, who should gather there, and what actions should take place along the way. Evidence from the geoglyphs suggests that people did more than stand at the edges and look. Ceramics, offerings, compacted surfaces, and possible traces of temporary structures have been found near lines and gathering points. Scientific examination of some surfaces indicates heavy foot traffic. The British Museum therefore presents group walking, music, dance, and public celebration as important parts of geoglyph use. A procession may have begun near a settlement or ceremonial centre. Participants could carry food, vessels, textiles, shells, plants, or other offerings. Musicians might play panpipes, drums, or whistles. Dogs sometimes appear beside people in Nazca procession imagery, which suggests that at least a few ceremonies included the ancient equivalent of someone bringing an animal that had no intention of following the planned route. A painted ceramic scene recorded by the British Museum shows 5 dressed figures carrying offerings and instruments, accompanied by 5 dogs. Julio Tello associated that scene with pilgrimages on the Palpa and Nazca Pampas. Walking in a group would make the lines understandable in a way that an aerial photograph does not. A broad track could hold many participants. A narrow route could arrange them into a sequence. A spiral would gradually turn the group inward or outward. Lines radiating from a mound could organise different approaches to one location. The route controlled movement without walls, doors, or signs asking everyone to form an orderly queue. The experience would also change through sound. The pampa is open and noise can travel across it. Panpipes played in groups could create overlapping notes, while drums established a repeated beat for walking or dancing. Archaeologists excavating at Kawachi found damaged ceramic panpipes, and one interpretation is that they were deliberately broken as offerings after ceremonial use. An instrument could therefore take part in the event and then be removed permanently from ordinary use. Kawachi was central to this ceremonial world during the early Nazca period, especially between roughly AD 50 and 300. Located near the Nazca River, it contained adobe mounds, plazas, terraces, enclosed spaces, and large open areas. excavations have found relatively limited evidence of dense permanent occupation compared with what would be expected in a major residential city. This has led archaeologists to interpret Kawachi primarily as a ritual and pilgrimage centre visited by communities from surrounding valleys. People arriving there may have stayed temporarily. They needed food, shade, water, and places to sleep, but they did not necessarily live at the site throughout the year. Large gatherings could fill plazas that appeared quiet at other times. Temporary shelters or canopies may have been erected, goods exchanged, meals prepared, and ceremonies conducted by people who had travelled from different settlements. A pilgrimage centre can be busy without being a normal city, rather like a festival site that spends most of the year looking as though everyone has gone to find lunch. Kawachi's location was closely connected with water distribution and movement through the region. The British Museum describes it as a place where water gathered from the highlands was controlled and as a starting point for paths leading toward geoglyphs and ceremonial areas. Its position between the Pacific and the Andes also made it useful for contact between coastal and highland communities. Control in this context did not necessarily mean that one ruler owned every drop and issued detailed instructions from an adobe office. It could involve organising canal maintenance, scheduling access, supervising ceremonies, or managing relationships among communities that depended on the same flows. Water creates cooperation because channels cross property and settlement boundaries. It can also create disagreement for exactly the same reason. Public ritual may have helped manage those relationships. A shared ceremony brought different groups into the same place, placed their actions within a recognised order, and linked practical needs with obligations to ancestors and deities. Communities could contribute food, labour, music, pottery or textiles. Leaders and religious specialists could demonstrate authority by organising the event, presenting offerings, and claiming the ability to communicate with forces connected to rain and fertility. This does not mean the ceremonies were empty performances designed only to keep leaders important. Participants may have taken the religious purpose seriously. Practical coordination and sincere belief can occur together. A gathering can distribute resources, strengthen alliances, honour ancestors, and ask for water at the same time. Human societies are quite capable of doing several things during one event, especially when food has been provided. Offerings made those relationships material. Broken pottery, shells, food remains, textiles and other objects could be placed at significant points. Smart history notes that offerings including conch shells have been found at locations where lines converge. Shells were especially meaningful because they came from the sea and often travelled over long distances. Their spiral forms have been compared with spiral geoglyphs, and with the curved access openings of some water systems, although these visual connections should be treated as suggestions rather than a complete code. A shell carried into the desert joined several regions in one object. It came from water, reached a dry inland plain through exchange, and could be placed near a route directed toward the mountains where river water originated. The offering did not have to explain this relationship in words. Its material, origin, and placement already made it appropriate. Food and drink were also likely important during gatherings. Maize could be prepared as food or fermented into chicha, a drink used widely in Andean communal and ritual settings. A Nazca cornstalk vessel in the Metropolitan Museum's collection reflects the crop's importance and notes maize beer's long ritual role in the Andes, including offerings to ancestors and landscapes considered animate. The exact recipes and practices of each Nazca ceremony are not preserved, but decorated serving vessels and large deposits of ceramic show that eating and drinking belong to public events. Ceramic vessels could be deliberately broken after use. This prevented them from returning to ordinary household service and turned the fragments into a permanent deposit. The act may seem wasteful when the vessel required hours of skilled work, but destruction can be meaningful in ritual. The object has completed its purpose. Breaking it marks the event and leaves something behind. Nazca art also contains trophy heads, weapons, masked figures, and supernatural beings. Some specialists connect trophy heads with conflict, ritual sacrifice, ancestor power, and efforts to control agricultural fertility. The evidence does not support one explanation for every example, but the heads clearly belong to ceremonial imagery rather than being random decorations added because a bowl looked slightly empty. Ritual connected with water was therefore not necessarily gentle. It could include altered states, sacrifice, public display, and the controlled destruction of valued objects. The British Museum notes the ceremonial use of the San Pedro cactus, which contains mescaline, and suggests that religious specialists may have consumed psychoactive substances while seeking contact with divine forces. Such practices would have changed perception, sound, and movement during an event. Masks and elaborate clothing helped separate ceremonial roles from ordinary ones. A person wearing a feline nose ornament, feathers, painted garments, or a supernatural mask no longer appeared simply as a farmer from a nearby valley. During the ritual, the costume could identify an ancestor, deity, specialist, or transformed participant. Nazca art repeatedly shows beings combining human, bird, feline, serpent, and marine features, which suggests that transformation was an important part of religious imagery. The surrounding land also took part in the ceremony. Hills were not neutral lumps of stone. Rivers were not only channels measured by flow. The open pampa, the mountain horizon, the coast, and the irrigated valley could all carry associations with origin, movement, ancestors, and fertility. UNESCO's description of the geoglyphs emphasizes that the figures and their surroundings form an indivisible cultural landscape. Removing the lines from that setting would remove much of their meaning. This is one reason astronomical interpretations cannot be considered separately from ritual and water. Observing where the sun rose or set at particular times could help organize seasonal activity. Mountain positions could combine celestial, geographic, and hydrological information. A line aligned with a solar event might also face a hill connected with water, or a route used during a ceremony. One function does not automatically cancel the others. Earlier researchers sometimes searched for a single universal system, such as a giant calendar in which every line corresponded to a star or date. The enormous number of lines makes that simple version difficult to maintain because a landscape containing so many directions will produce some alignments by chance. UNESCO still notes possible ritual and astronomical functions, but current interpretations usually allow for varied purposes across different periods and areas. Water-based explanations face a similar limit. Not every line points clearly toward a river, mountain, or underground source. Some relationships may be symbolic rather than direct. Others may reflect social routes, pilgrimage paths, or boundaries. The safest conclusion is not that all geoglyphs formed a water map, but that water and agricultural fertility were central concerns within the ceremonial system that produced and used many of them. The geoglyphs may also have divided the pampa socially. Different families, settlements, or local groups could maintain their own routes and gathering areas. Smart history suggests that the landscape may have acted as a map of social divisions, with communities tending particular geoglyphs. Direct evidence for the names and membership of those groups is missing, but repeated construction and maintenance would have required some system of responsibility. A group that cleared a line had invested labour in the place. Returning to it reinforced ownership, memory, or obligation. Children could learn the route from older relatives. Offerings deposited at a mound accumulated a history. A crossing point became meaningful because earlier gatherings had occurred there. The sacred quality of the landscape grew through repeated use rather than appearing only when the first stones were moved. Archaeologists Clive Ruggles and Nicholas Saunders studied parts of the lines from ground level and identified a complex route they interpreted as a ceremonial labyrinth. The course was not designed to display a neat image from above. It guided participants through a sequence of turns and passages. Their work demonstrates that walking can reveal organisation that is difficult to understand from an aircraft, where every line appears at once but the order of a movement disappears. A person following such a route might pass close to a destination several times before reaching it. The design could prolong the journey, separate participants, or create a controlled sequence. Modern visitors sometimes experience a similar problem in airports, although the airport usually claims the arrangement is for convenience. Ceremonial walking also explains why some lines show compacted surfaces and why pottery fragments occur along them. The line was not only a picture or direction, it was a place where actions happened. People could sing, dance, stop, pour liquid, break vessels, or place objects at marked points. Different stages of the route may have carried different rules. The timing of these events probably followed agricultural and social needs. A ceremony might take place before planting, during a period of uncertain flow at harvest, or when groups assembled for exchange. The exact schedule is unknown because there are no written Nazca records. Seasonal timing remains a reasonable inference from the society's dependence on farming and from broader Andean patterns, but it should not be presented as a recovered program with confirmed dates and starting times. Environmental instability made those ceremonies increasingly urgent. Research summarised by the British Museum suggests that the region became more difficult to inhabit over time as desertification progressed and population shifted toward higher ground. Severe climate events could also produce destructive floods rather than useful steady flow. Too little water damaged fields slowly. Too much water arriving at once could destroy canals, settlements, and the very ground people had marked. The Nazca response involved practical adaptation, social reorganisation, and ritual action. These were not competing approaches. Repairing canals addressed immediate damage. Moving settlements reduced exposure. Holding ceremonies restored relationships with ancestors, neighbouring groups, and sacred places. When a society lacks control over rainfall, it uses every form of knowledge available. The famous underground filtration galleries called puquios are often included in this story as Nazca inventions. They channel groundwater through subterranean passages and remain impressive features of the region. Their dating, however, is debated. Archaeological settlement surveys reported by Catarina Schreiber and Josué Lancho Rojas indicate that the systems did not yet exist during the early Nazca phases, though they were in use by the time of the Inca conquest. Some may have developed late or been modified repeatedly. They show the long history of water management around Nazca, but they should not automatically be assigned to the makers of every geoglyph. That caution matters because the desire for one clear story can combine evidence from different centuries. A spiral line, a later puquio opening, an ancient shell offering, and a modern local tradition may resemble one another. But resemblance alone does not prove that they formed a single, original system. Archaeology works best when connections are tested rather than arranged into the most convenient pattern. Even with those limits, the relationship among water, ritual and landscape remains strong. Kawachi stood near controlled water and routes to ceremonial zones. People walked heavily on lines, gathered near converging paths, left offerings, played music and used images tied to animals, crops, ancestors and supernatural power. The mountain supplied the rivers, while the pampa provided a setting where communities could organise their response to that dependence. Seen from the ground, the sacred landscape was active. A group left a green valley and entered the dry plain. The route continued toward a mound or distant ridge. Music carried ahead of the walkers. A vessel held food, drink, or another offering. At the gathering place, people met others who had followed separate lines from different directions. The event joined communities that depended on the same, uncertain water system. Seen from the air, those actions disappear. The people become absent and only the geometry remains. Straight lines cross one another. Trapezoids point toward the horizon. Animals lie between them. This change of viewpoint produced many of the theories that later made Nazca famous. pilgrimage routes became astronomical instruments, water ceremonies became coded maps, and broad cleared surfaces became alleged runways for visitors who left no tools, buildings, or luggage behind. To understand how those ideas developed, the view now rises above the walking routes and moves into the period when explorers, archaeologists, pilots, mathematicians, and popular writers began trying to explain the desert from a very different position. As the view rises above the walking routes, the shape of the Nazca landscape changes quickly. From the ground, a person sees pale paths, stone borders, low mounds, and long stretches of gravel. From an aircraft, those separate marks begin to connect. A curved line becomes the back of an animal. Two narrow paths become wings. A spiral turns into a monkey's tail. Straight lines that seemed unrelated form large networks across the plain. This difference between the ground view and the aerial view did more than reveal the designs. It shaped nearly every modern theory about them. The lines were not completely unknown before aircraft began crossing southern Peru. Local residents had long lived beside the desert and travelled through it. Archaeological remains were visible in the region, and people moving across nearby hills could see parts of the geoglyphs. The more accurate story is not that the lines were suddenly discovered in an empty land. They entered formal archaeological study and later became known to an international public. Peruvian archaeologist Toribio Mejia Gespe began examining the lines systematically in 1926 after encountering them during fieldwork. He studied them from the ground and from elevated positions, interpreting some as sacred roads or ceremonial paths. This was several years before regular aerial observation made the animal figures famous. His interpretation is important because it began with movement across the landscape rather than with the complete image visible from above. Mejia Gespe saw routes that could have been used by people. A path does not need to reveal a picture to be meaningful. Its direction, destination, width, and relationship to nearby hills can matter more than its appearance from the sky. His work did not solve the purpose of the lines, but it established an approach that later returned to archaeology after several more dramatic ideas had received most of the attention. During the 1930s, increasing air traffic over southern Peru introduced a very different viewpoint. Pilots and passengers could see geometric forms and animals that were difficult to recognize while standing beside them. Reports and photographs spread. The desert no longer appeared to contain only tracks and cleared areas. It seemed to contain a hidden picture that had been waiting for modern flight to make it visible. That impression created an immediate question. Why would ancient people make images that appeared most complete from a position they could not easily reach? The question sounds reasonable, but it contains an assumption. It assumes that the complete aerial image was the main purpose of the work. It also assumes that ancient makers cared about viewing the finished figure in the same way a modern tourist does. The original users may have known the form without needing to see it all at once. They could walk it, discuss it, maintain it, and connect it with a ceremony. Nearby slopes provided wider views, and construction did not require anyone to hover above the pampa. Even so, the aerial perspective became the main way the public encountered Nazca. It encouraged explanations based on astronomy, coded messages, advanced surveying, and eventually visitors from outer space. A large bird photographed from an aircraft looks like an object designed for the sky. A ceremonial route viewed from the ground looks like a place designed for human feet. The same line supports different stories depending on the height of the observer. American historian Paul Kosok arrived in the region while studying ancient irrigation systems. In the early 1940s, he began examining the lines from the ground and air. During the southern winter solstice, he observed the sun setting close to the direction of one long line. Kosok interpreted this alignment as evidence that at least some of the markings had astronomical significance. He described the Pampa as a vast astronomical book, and the calendar theory soon became one of the best-known explanations for the entire site. The idea made practical sense at first. Farming societies needed to follow seasonal changes. The positions of the sun and stars could help mark times for planting, harvesting, ceremonies, and the arrival of expected water. Long straight lines looked suitable for observing points on the horizon. If one line aligned with the solstice sunset, perhaps others marked additional solar or stellar events. Kosok was joined by Maria Reich, a German-born mathematician and translator who later became a Peruvian citizen. She first travelled to the Nazca area in 1941 and began sustained field research in 1946. Reich spent decades measuring, mapping, photographing and protecting the lines. She worked under difficult desert conditions, often carrying simple surveying equipment and clearing loose material so that faint outlines could be recorded. Her dedication made her one of the most important figures in the modern history of Nazca research. Reich supported the astronomical and calendrical interpretation. She proposed that certain lines marked the rising or setting of the sun, moon, or important stars. She also explored the possibility that some animal figures represented constellations or seasonal information. Her mathematical background encouraged her to search for measurements and relationships that might reveal an organized system beneath the apparent confusion. This approach appealed to a public that wanted one answer capable of explaining everything. The desert became a giant observatory. Straight lines became sighting devices. Animals became star groups. The whole pampa could be imagined as a calendar large enough for an entire society to use, though checking an appointment would have involved a considerable walk. Reicher's greatest contribution was not limited to her preferred interpretation. She documented designs that might otherwise have been damaged or forgotten, attracted international attention to their importance, and campaigned for protection at a time when roads, vehicles, and development threatened the surface. UNESCO notes that research, conservation, and permanent protective work involving Reich and Peruvian authorities has continued since the 1940s. Her public image became closely connected with the desert. She was often photographed carrying measuring tools across the pampa or standing beside lines she had studied for years. The image of one determined researcher protecting a vast archaeological landscape helped make the site understandable to people who might never visit Peru. It also encouraged the idea that the lines contained a single hidden solution, waiting for enough careful measurement. The astronomical theory soon faced a statistical problem. The Nazca landscape contains an enormous number of lines pointing in many directions. When hundreds or thousands of directions are available, some will align with the rising or setting of celestial objects by chance. Finding one impressive alignment is not enough. Researchers must show that meaningful alignments occur more often than random distribution would produce. In 1969, American astronomer Gerald Hawkins used measurements and statistical testing to examine a selected group of lines. Hawkins was already known for investigating possible astronomical alignments at Stonehenge. At Nazca, his results did not support the idea that the whole system functioned as a large astronomical calendar. Some alignments existed, but the pattern was not strong enough to explain the complete landscape. Later, researchers continued to study possible connections with the sky. Anthony Aveni, Gary Urton, and others produced more detailed surveys and concluded that astronomy may have influenced some lines without accounting for all of them. Modern investigations have also identified correlations between certain geoglyph directions and celestial events, but the subject remains disputed. The current position is more cautious than the original giant calendar theory. Some lines may have had astronomical roles. The entire pampa was almost certainly not one unified instrument. This does not make Kosok and Reich foolish or their work useless. Early interpretations often begin with the strongest pattern visible at the time. Their measurements created records that later scholars could test. The rejection of one broad theory is part of research, not evidence that the original researchers failed. They asked a serious question, gathered information, and encouraged others to examine it more closely. While astronomers measured directions, archaeologists looked for evidence of how people used the ground. Pottery fragments, Stone piles, paths, settlements, water sources, and ceremonial centres provided information that aerial geometry alone could not supply. The lines began to look less like a code written for distant viewers and more like parts of a landscape where people walked, gathered, and left objects. Johann Reinhard developed an influential interpretation in the 1980s that connected the lines with mountain worship, water, and agricultural fertility. He argued that mountains and water sources held major religious importance in the Andes. Many straight lines may have served as sacred paths leading toward places where ceremonies were conducted, while broad triangles and rectangles could have formed spaces for fertility rites. Under this interpretation, a line did not need to point precisely at a star or directly identify a water channel. Its meaning could come from ceremonial movement through a landscape tied to water. This theory fitted the environmental setting. The Nazca communities depended on seasonal water from the Andes. Mountains stood in the direction from which rainfall and river flows originated. Ceremonies asking for water, honouring ancestors, or maintaining relationships with sacred places would have addressed a constant concern. The geoglyphs could therefore combine practical geography with religious action. A water-related interpretation should not be simplified into the claim that the lines formed a map of underground channels. Some do not match known water sources, and many have relationships that remain unclear. The stronger argument concerns ritual rather than plumbing. People may have used lines while seeking water and fertility, but the lines were not necessarily instructions telling someone where to dig a well. Other archaeologists focused on processions and social organisation. The wide tracks, converging routes, and open geometric forms could accommodate groups. Communities may have maintained separate lines or gathering places. Walking together, carrying offerings, playing music and breaking pottery would turn the ground into an active ceremonial environment. Clive Ruggles and Nicholas Saunders later examined a complex set of lines at ground level and argued that it formed a ceremonial labyrinth. Their analysis depended on working out which lines belonged to the same period and then following the route as an original participant might have done. From above, the design appeared to be another confusing group of crossings. From the ground, it created a controlled journey with repeated turns. The labyrinth study shows how aerial vision can both reveal and conceal. It reveals the full geometry but hides the order in which a person experiences it. A map of a garden maze is easy to understand from above. Walking inside the maze is different, especially if the route has no helpful sign saying, "This way to the ceremonial centre and refreshments." The lines may have had several purposes because they were made over many centuries. Earlier Paracas communities created hillside figures that could be viewed from below. Later Nazca groups made large line-type animals and geometric forms across flatter plains. Different communities added new designs, crossed older ones, and changed how existing places were used. UNESCO describes the area as a symbolic, ritual, and social landscape created through long continuous activity, rather than as one project planned at a single moment. That time depth weakens every theory that requires one designer and one purpose. One line may have marked a ceremonial direction, another may have organised a procession, a third may have related to a solar event. A broad cleared area may have supported a gathering, while a nearby animal figure identified the place, or connected it with a religious story. The desire for one answer belongs more to modern storytelling than to the archaeological evidence. No theory has attracted more public attention than the claim that the lines were made for extraterrestrial visitors. The most influential version was popularized by Swiss writer Erich von Däniken in his 1968 book Chariots of the Gods. He suggested that ancient monuments and images around the world showed contact with advanced beings from space. At Nazca, broad geometric forms were described as possible runways or signals intended for aircraft. The idea arrived at a convenient moment. Public interest in space travel, unidentified flying objects, and the coming moon landing was extremely high. Aerial photographs of enormous desert markings seemed to fit a story about machines descending from the sky. The theory required no understanding of Andean pilgrimage, water rituals, pottery, or social organisation. It offered spaceships instead, which are admittedly easier to place on a dramatic book cover. There is no archaeological evidence for alien construction, landing sites, advanced machinery, or extraterrestrial contact at Nazca. The broad forms do not function well as runways. Many cross uneven terrain, contain loose surfaces, intersect other lines, or end without the space needed for landing and departure. More importantly, their construction can be explained through known human methods using stakes, cords, measurement, and organised labour. The alien theory also creates a deeper problem. It treats ancient achievement as evidence that ancient people could not have achieved it. The Nazca made complex textiles, controlled irrigation, built adobe ceremonial centres, produced multicoloured pottery, organised long-distance exchange, and laid out large figures using simple surveying. Giving credit to imaginary visitors removes knowledge and agency from the people whose material culture is present throughout the region. Mystery does not require aliens. Archaeologists openly admit that no complete explanation exists. Uncertainty remains because the Nazca left no written guide to the lines, not because the evidence points beyond Earth. A missing answer is not evidence for whichever answer happens to be most exciting. The aerial view encouraged other theories as well. Some writers proposed maps of underground water, others saw genealogies, territorial boundaries, running tracks, weaving patterns, ceremonial stages, or systems for marking social groups. A few ideas have received limited archaeological support, others rely mainly on visual resemblance. With enough lines, almost any familiar object can be found somewhere in the network, especially if the observer is willing to rotate the photograph. Researchers now test theories by combining viewpoints and types of evidence. Aerial photographs show overall form, satellite images reveal regional distribution, drones record details at high resolution, excavation identifies pottery, offerings, and construction sequences. Ground surveys show whether a figure was visible from a nearby path. Dating methods estimate when selected features were made. Comparisons with ceramics and textiles place the images within Nazca art. This combined approach has produced discoveries that earlier surveys missed. Yamagata University researchers have spent years mapping geoglyphs through aerial imagery and field inspection. In 2024, a joint project with IBM Research reported 303 newly confirmed figurative geoglyphs found during 6 months of field work after artificial intelligence helped identify promising locations in large sets of aerial data. The discovery nearly doubled the known number of figurative geoglyphs in the surveyed pampa. The AI did not look at the desert and announce that it had solved Nazca. It marked areas whose shapes resembled known geoglyphs. Archaeologists then visited those locations and checked whether stones had been deliberately moved. This was necessary because natural channels, modern tracks, and random stone arrangements can look convincing in photographs. Computers are very efficient at finding possible patterns. They are less reliable at deciding whether every pattern represents a 2,000-year-old person carrying a stick. The newly recorded figures strengthen the idea that different kinds of geoglyphs serve different settings. Large line-type figures mostly represented wild animals and were associated with networks of straight lines and trapezoids, which the researchers linked with community-level rituals. Smaller relief-type figures commonly showed humans and domesticated camelids, and were placed within view of winding trails, where individuals or small groups could see them while travelling. This finding directly challenges the claim that geoglyphs were made only for observers in the sky. Many smaller images were designed to be encountered from nearby paths. Even the large figures belong to networks that people could walk. Aerial vision is useful for modern documentation, but it was not necessarily the original audience. The pace of discovery has increased because researchers can scan areas that are difficult to cover entirely on foot. Earlier aerial photographs, drone surveys, three-dimensional models, and AI-assisted searches allow faint markings to be compared across large regions. Yamagata University reported in 2023 that deep learning methods could identify likely candidates far faster than manual review of the same imagery, though every proposed figure still required inspection on the ground. New technology has therefore made the Nazca landscape larger rather than simpler. Each discovery adds another figure, route, location, and possible relationship. The increased evidence may eventually allow stronger conclusions, but it also reveals that the familiar hummingbird and monkey represent only a small part of the tradition. International recognition brought greater protection. UNESCO inscribed the lines and geoglyphs of Nazca and Palpa on the World Heritage List in 1994, recognizing their unmatched scale, variety, cultural continuity, and importance as a ritual and social landscape. The protected property covers more than 75,000 hectares, while the central concentration of well-known geoglyphs extends across hundreds of square kilometres. Protection remains difficult because the same dry surface that preserves an ancient line also preserves modern damage. A tyre track can remain visible for years. Roads, mining, farming, illegal entry, and uncontrolled vehicle movement have all created risks. UNESCO has repeatedly noted the need for monitoring, especially near the Pan-American Highway, which crosses the archaeological area and has already damaged sections of lines and figures. The modern aerial view can help with this problem. Satellites and drones allow authorities to identify new disturbances and compare the condition of vulnerable areas over time. The same perspective that encouraged some of the least reliable theories now supports practical conservation. Seen from above, the desert still appears to offer a hidden answer. The eye follows lines toward the horizon and expects them to spell out one clear message. Archaeology has produced a less tidy result. The lines were probably connected with ritual, water, movement, social identity, and important places. Some may have marked astronomical events. Different figures belong to different periods and audiences. Their uses could change, and later people could cross or reuse earlier designs. That conclusion may seem less satisfying than a giant calendar or an alien landing ground, but it fits the evidence more closely. The Nazca landscape was not a machine built for one function. It was a place used repeatedly by living communities. The remaining mystery is not whether human beings could make the lines. They could, and the construction methods are well understood. The more difficult question is how individual meanings were shared. Which stories were told about the animals? Who decided where a new line should begin? Did each valley maintain its own routes? Were some figures restricted to particular groups? What words were spoken when pottery was broken or liquid poured onto the ground? Those details may never be recovered completely. The lack of writing leaves the stones to carry more information than stones usually manage. Researchers can measure, map, date, and compare them, but the voices of the makers remain absent. The aerial photographs created the modern mystery by allowing people to see the designs all at once. Continued research has slowly returned people to the picture. Feet moved along the lines, hands carried stones, communities met in cleared spaces, pilgrims approached kawachi, musicians played panpipes, farmers watched rivers that depended on distant rain. As the view lowers again, this strange geometry becomes part of daily life rather than a message detached from it. The lines remain extraordinary, but their importance no longer depends on being impossible. What remains is the evidence of a society that marked the ground on a scale few others attempted, and a desert that continues to preserve those decisions while researchers, visitors, and local communities consider what should be carried forward from them. The aircraft turns away from the pampa, and the familiar figures begin to shrink. The hummingbird becomes a few pale lines. The spider disappears into the surrounding tracks. The monkey's tail remains visible for a moment longer, then blends into the wide brown surface. From this height, the desert seems quiet again, yet the work of understanding and protecting it continues on the ground. The Nazca Lines have survived because the environment changed very slowly. Rain is rare, vegetation is sparse, and the gravel surface remained stable for long periods. Those conditions preserved marks that would have vanished quickly in a wetter region. they did not make the lines indestructible. A careless vehicle can cross in seconds what people protected through simple good fortune for nearly 2,000 years. A road, trench, rubbish pile, fence post, or repeated footsteps can leave damage that the desert does not politely repair when everyone has gone home. This makes the lines unusual, archaeological remains. A stone temple can lose a block and still be recognised as a building. A ceramic vessel can be placed in a museum case. A textile can be stored in controlled light. A geoglyph is the surface of the land itself. It cannot be moved indoors, wrapped in protective material, or placed on a shelf marked "Please do not touch." Protecting it means protecting a large landscape in which ancient marks, modern settlements, roads, farms, businesses, and daily travel exist close together. The lines and geoglyphs of Nazca and Palpa were added to UNESCO's World Heritage List in 1994. The protected property covers more than 75,000 hectares and is recognised for the scale, variety and survival of its lines, geometric forms, and representational images. UNESCO describes them not only as works of design, but as part of a ritual and social landscape created by communities over many centuries. World Heritage status does not place an invisible shield over the Pampa. It creates international recognition and obligations. But practical protection still depends on Peruvian authorities, archaeologists, police, local governments, landowners, residents, guides, and visitors. Boundaries have to be marked. Damaged areas have to be recorded. Illegal work has to be stopped. Waste has to be removed. People need clear information about where they may walk, drive, build, or dig. In July 2026, Peru's Ministry of Culture announced new recovery work in the Soco sector of the archaeological reserve. The plans included cleaning roughly 6 hectares affected by dumped material and rubbish, improving drainage, adding fencing and a guard post, and installing 91 boundary markers along part of the Pan-American Highway. These are not dramatic discoveries involving a new animal or a mysterious line. They are the ordinary, necessary tasks that allow the famous discoveries to survive. Only a few weeks earlier, cultural authorities and police had stopped unauthorized excavation and trench digging in another protected sector. 7 people were found working with construction materials and equipment inside the archaeological reserve. The incident showed how quickly damage can begin and why reports from local residents matter. A geoglyph does not send an alarm when someone drives across it. It depends on people noticing and deciding that the ground is worth defending. This responsibility can be difficult because the archaeological landscape is much larger than the handful of figures reproduced on postcards. The hummingbird, monkey and spider are easy to name and promote. Thousands of less obvious lines, roots, stone piles, cleared areas, and small figures occupy a much wider region. Some are so faint that an untrained observer might stand beside them without realizing anything ancient is present. A person who recognizes the hummingbird may still mistake a narrow ancient route for an ordinary vehicle track. Someone may believe an empty-looking patch of gravel is safe for construction because no giant animal is visible. Protection therefore requires detailed surveys rather than attention only to the most famous designs. The desert does not provide helpful ropes around each important feature, although the modern conservation team is doing its best to improve the signage. New technology is helping researchers identify what remains hidden. High-resolution aerial photography, drones, satellite images, computer mapping, and artificial intelligence can examine large areas more efficiently than walking every meter of the pampa. They do not remove the need for fieldwork. A suspected shape still has to be checked on the ground, where archaeologists can study whether stones were deliberately moved and whether the figure belongs to an ancient construction, rather than a natural pattern or a recent disturbance. In research announced in 2024, a team from Yamagata University and IBM used artificial intelligence to review aerial imagery and identify likely geoglyph locations. Archaeologists then inspected those places and confirmed 303 previously undocumented figurative geoglyphs during 6 months of fieldwork, Many were smaller relief-type images near ancient trails, including people and domesticated animals, rather than enormous line-type creatures designed across the open pampa. The number was impressive, but its meaning was more important. The new figures showed that Nazca image-making was not limited to a small collection of giant animals. Smaller designs may have been placed where travellers could see them while walking. Some appear to show human activities and objects rather than distant wild creatures. This suggests several forms of communication and ritual use operating within the same broad landscape. The famous large designs may have supported communal events involving many people. Smaller figures beside paths may have been encountered by families, travellers, pilgrims, or work groups. One kind of image could identify a ceremonial area. Another could mark part of a journey. A third might present a familiar scene or warning. Researchers still have to test these possibilities, but the growing collection makes the old question, what were the Nazca Lines for, increasingly difficult to answer with one sentence. This is not a problem that better technology will necessarily remove. More discoveries often produce more questions. Before the smaller figures were documented, the landscape could be described mainly through giant birds, animals, and long geometric forms. The new evidence adds people, camelids, heads, tools, and scenes near paths. Instead of revealing one secret code, the pampa is beginning to look more like a place where different kinds of messages and actions accumulated over generations. That may be the clearest thing the Nazca Lines still tell us. Ancient societies were not simple because their tools were simple. The makers could plan at several scales, organize labour, maintain irrigation, travel between ecological regions, produce complex art, and create public spaces without writing down an explanation for modern readers. Their knowledge was carried through practice, memory, teaching, ceremony, and repeated movement. A child could learn a line by walking it with older relatives. A potter could repeat an animal seen on vessels made by earlier generations. A group could return to the same gathering place each season. A religious specialist could explain which offering belonged at a particular mound. None of this required a printed map. It required people who remembered what to do and taught others before the information disappeared. Some of that information eventually did disappear. We do not know the original names of most figures. We cannot repeat the exact words spoken during a procession. We do not know which songs were played on the panpipes, which families maintained individual routes, or what a participant believed while following a spiral. Archaeologists can recover objects and patterns, but not every thought attached to them. It is tempting to treat these missing details as invitations to invent. A line points toward a hill, so it becomes a perfect water map. A bird resembles a constellation, so the whole desert becomes an observatory. A broad trapezoid looks vaguely suitable for landing, so someone adds a spacecraft and hopes nobody asks where the fuel was stored. A more careful approach accepts that several interpretations can remain possible. Water, fertility, pilgrimage, social identity, astronomy, ancestor worship, and public ceremony all fit parts of the evidence. They do not have to compete for one available seat. A route could face a mountain associated with water, be walked during a seasonal gathering, and align roughly with a significant sunrise. Human activity often combines location, timing, religion, and practical need. Modern places work the same way. A town square can hold a market in the morning, a political gathering in the afternoon, and a celebration at night. A road can transport goods, mark a boundary, lead toward a religious site, and become part of a procession once a year. Future archaeologists who insist that it performed only one function would create a mystery where none originally existed. The Nazca landscape probably changed meaning as well. A line made by one generation could be crossed by another. An animal might remain visible after the ceremony connected with it had changed. A community could reuse a place without preserving its first explanation. The overlapping designs show that later makers did not always treat earlier work as a finished museum display. This may be difficult for modern visitors to understand because we approach the Pampa as protected heritage. We expect every ancient mark to be preserved exactly where it is. The original makers were participants, not conservation officers. They used the landscape. They renewed routes, added figures, moved through old designs, and created new relationships between places. The lines also remind us that enormous achievements do not always require enormous machines. Most of the designs were created by moving small stones. Their scale came from organisation rather than advanced equipment. A team marked a route, stretched cords, aligned stakes, and cleared the surface. Thousands of simple movements produce something too large for one worker to view completely. This is one reason the alien explanation remains popular. It makes the size of the lines feel easier to understand by adding technology. Yet doing so misses the more useful lesson. Human beings can coordinate their work around a shared idea even when no individual controls the whole result. The same principle built irrigation systems, ceremonial centres, roads, terraces, and settlements across the ancient Andes. The worker lifting a stone did not need to see the entire hummingbird. The person guiding the cord did not need to complete every section. The planner did not need an aircraft. Each person needed a task, a method, and confidence that the separate tasks would connect. That kind of cooperation may be less dramatic than a machine descending from the sky, but it tells us far more about civilization. The Nazca Lines also continue to influence how people outside Peru imagine the ancient Americas. Too often, ancient societies are introduced through disappearance and mystery. We hear that a people vanished, left an impossible monument, and provided no explanation. This framing creates excitement, but it can remove the communities themselves from the story. The Nazca did not exist only to make a puzzle for us. They raised food, managed water, made clothing, traded goods, cared for children, honoured ancestors, experienced conflict, and adapted to environmental change. Their culture changed and was absorbed into later societies, rather than simply evaporating after the last geoglyph was completed. The region remains inhabited, and the archaeological heritage forms part of modern Peruvian identity. Local people work as archaeologists, conservation staff, pilots, drivers, guides, hotel workers, farmers, teachers, officials, and business owners. Tourism can support livelihoods and public interest, but it also has to be managed carefully. Visitors need access without turning the Pampa into a surface crossed by uncontrolled traffic. Responsible tourism begins with a simple rule. The lines are best protected by not treating them like an interactive floor display. Approved observation towers, regulated flights, museums, and guided routes allow people to learn without walking directly over fragile features. A perfect photograph is not worth leaving a new line that future archaeologists will have to label careless visitor, early 21st century. Research and protection also have to include the wider environment. Changing rainfall patterns and sudden floods can damage normally stable surfaces. Remote sensing and flood modelling are being used to identify vulnerable geoglyphs, especially near roads and drainage channels. The dry climate preserved the designs, but unusual water movement can cut through them quickly. Climate is not the only source of pressure. Settlement growth, mining, roads, illegal occupation, dumping and construction all affect land around the protected zones. Peru's Ministry of Culture has issued additional protective measures for archaeological sectors in the Nazca and Palpa region during 2025 and 2026, while also updating management arrangements and carrying out recovery operations. These actions show that conservation is not one decision made when UNESCO recognition was granted. It is a continuing process involving boundaries, inspections, legal protection, and cooperation with local authorities. There is a useful contrast here. The Nazca people created the lines by removing stones. Modern society can protect them only by adding layers of work, laws, maps, signs, patrols, education, surveys, digital records, and public support. The ancient method was physically straightforward. The modern responsibility is administratively impressive, which is a polite way of saying that it involves a great deal of paperwork. Digital recording provides one form of protection. Detailed photographs and three-dimensional models preserve information about the current state of a figure. If erosion or human activity later causes damage, researchers can compare images and measure what changed. A digital record cannot replace the original ground, but it can support restoration decisions, research and monitoring. The new surveys may also allow researchers to recognize groups of figures made at different times. Changes in subject scale, construction method and location can reveal how the geoglyph tradition developed. Earlier hillside figures, large line-type animals, geometric networks, and smaller relief-type images may belong to related but distinct forms of activity. Future discoveries will probably change some current explanations. A figure now considered isolated may turn out to belong to a larger root. A supposed animal may be re-identified. Better dating may separate designs that were assumed to be contemporary. A place interpreted as ceremonial may also show evidence of travel, exchange, or temporary settlement. Changing an explanation is not a weakness. Archaeology is built from incomplete evidence. New information improves the picture, even when it removes a satisfying theory. The Nazca Lines have attracted confident answers for almost a century, but the strongest research often begins with the less exciting phrase, "the evidence suggests." That phrase leaves room for the Nazca people rather than replacing them with our own preferences. It allows a bird to remain uncertain in species but important in context. It allows astronomy to matter without turning every line into a star chart. It allows water to shape ritual without forcing every trapezoid to conceal an underground canal. The Pampa is valuable partly because it does not provide one simple answer. It shows how a landscape can serve as art, route, gathering place, memory system, and sacred ground. It shows that the boundary between a picture and a path is not always clear. A line can be viewed, walked, repaired, and remembered. The same uncertainty encourages us to pay attention to what is known. We know the figures were human constructions. We know the surface was cleared deliberately. We know the designs accumulated across many generations. We know related animals and supernatural beings appeared on pottery and textiles. We know people gathered, travelled, exchanged goods, managed water, and created ceremonial centres in the surrounding valleys. We know that the lines survived because of a rare combination of climate, geology, and continued protection. We also know that survival is not guaranteed. The next century of the Nazca Lines depends less on solving their original purpose than on making careful choices in the present. That may be their clearest message for us. A landscape can hold information for thousands of years, but only when people agree not to erase it. The Nazca makers worked for communities they knew. They could not have imagined satellites, computer vision, tourist flights, or millions of strangers recognizing the shape of their hummingbird. Their work reached us anyway. It reached us without a written language attached to the designs. It reached us through dark stones placed beside pale earth. It survived political change, environmental stress, the decline of ceremonial centres, new cultures, colonial rule, modern roads, and the arrival of aircraft. The figures remained on the ground while every society around them changed. Somewhere on the Pampa there may still be another figure waiting to be recognised. It may be small and worn, positioned beside a trail that has not been carefully studied. An aerial image may reveal one curve. A computer may mark the location as unusual. An archaeologist may walk out with a map, inspect the stones, and realise that a person made the shape nearly 2,000 years ago. The discovery will appear new to us, but the figure itself will not be new. It has been there through every night, every season, and every century since its makers completed it. Our knowledge changes suddenly. The desert does not. And so we return to the place where this journey began. A quiet plain between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes. At first, there seemed to be only gravel and distance. Then the lines appeared. We followed them through the lives of the Nazca people, across their fields and settlements, into Cahuachi, along ceremonial routes, and around animals drawn on a scale that required many hands. We saw how the designs were made, how water may have influenced their use, and how the view from an aircraft encouraged both serious research and imaginative stories. We met the hummingbird, monkey, spider, birds from distant environments, creatures from the sea, and human figures beside ancient paths. The mystery has not disappeared. It has become more specific. We no longer need to ask whether humans could make the lines. The answer is clear. We ask which people made each design, when they used it, how they understood it, and what happened as meanings changed. Those questions may remain open for a long time. That is not a reason to fill the silence with the loudest theory available. It is a reason to listen more carefully to the evidence already present. The moved stones, worn surfaces, broken pottery, animal forms, mountain directions, and routes connecting communities. Before we leave the desert, think about where you're listening from tonight. What does the ground outside your home remember? Which roads, fields, buildings, or paths would still make sense if every sign and written explanation disappeared? What might a future observer understand correctly, and what perfectly ordinary object would they declare to be a sacred astronomical device? If you found this journey calming or interesting, you can leave a like, subscribe to Just About Earth, and share this quiet corner with someone who enjoys the long stories written into our planet. It helps these slow explorations reach other listeners who may be ready to exchange a busy screen for a desert filled with very old questions. For now, the aircraft has landed, the last instruments have become quiet, and the pampa remains where it has always been. The hummingbird rests with its wings extended. The monkey keeps its tail curled. Straight lines continue toward hills that once guided people across the plain. They are not waiting for visitors from the sky. They are waiting for us to study them carefully, protect them responsibly, and remember the people who placed every stone. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you're listening from tonight.